only if you promise he comes here to help, not to start a fight. That was all Emily Carter managed to whisper before her boss picked up the phone and dialed the number that would change everything about that quiet little diner and about the woman who had been quietly breaking apart inside it for an entire week. If you've ever been the person who kept smiling while something inside you was falling apart, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter had a gift that most people never recognized as the burden it truly was. She could make pain invisible. Not just her own pain, though. Lord knows she had practice with that, but the kind of pain that settled into a person's bones after years of showing up, working hard and learning early in life that the world moved faster when you didn't slow it down with your problems. Emily had learned that lesson somewhere around age 14, when her mother got sick and her brother Jackson became the only steady thing in a house that felt like it was tilting sideways every single day. She had learned to set her jaw, pull her shoulders back, and keep moving, and she had never unlearned it. So when the metal floor strip near the kitchen entrance of Riverside Grill started lifting, not all at once, not in some dramatic way that would demand immediate attention, but slowly, gradually, the way dangerous things tend to happen when nobody's paying close enough attention, Emily noticed it, reported it, and then continued walking through it every single shift, because what else was she going to do? The food still needed to be carried. The tables still needed serving. The customers still needed their coffee before 7 in the morning. And Emily Carter was not the kind of woman who made her problems everyone else's emergency. The first time it caught her shoe, she stumbled forward and caught herself on the edge of the pass-through counter. Her left hand slapped the metal hard enough to sting, and a plate of scrambled eggs nearly went sideways, but she steadied it. She checked behind her to see if anyone had noticed. 2 truckers in the corner booth were arguing about a route through Wyoming. The cook, Darnell, had his back turned. Her co-worker, Patty, was refilling the key station on the far wall. Nobody had seen. Emily straightened her apron, adjusted her grip on the tray, and kept moving. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, her left ankle was tender, in a way that made climbing out of her truck every morning feel like a small act of punishment. The metal strip had shifted again. She could see it clearly. The edge bent upward at almost a 45-degree angle, now catching the light in a way that made it look almost intentional, like a little trap someone had set right at the most unavoidable part of the floor. Every server had to pass through that narrow space between the kitchen door and the prep counter. There was no route around it. You either went through it or you didn't work the floor. She had written it down on the maintenance log the previous Friday. She had noted the location, described the hazard, and signed her name at the bottom, the way the employee handbook said to do. She had even mentioned it verbally to Calvin Brooks when she saw him doing his Tuesday walkthrough, not because she expected fanfare, not because she wanted anyone making a fuss, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be said out loud so there could be no confusion later about whether anyone knew. Calvin had looked where she pointed. He had nodded the way people nod when they're already thinking about the next thing on their list. "Watch your step," he said, and moved on. Emily had stared at his back for just a moment, just a half-second longer than was polite, before turning around and going back to her tables. Watch your step, as if the problem were her feet. By Friday morning, every step on that ankle felt like someone pressing a thumb into a bruise. She had started unconsciously shifting her weight to her right side when she walked, which by midday was making her hip ache in protest. She was compensating for the compensation. She wrapped her ankle with an elastic bandage before work and wore her thickest socks and told herself it would be fine. It was just a minor thing. She'd had worse. A sprained ankle healed. The diner was busy. Tips were decent, and her landlord didn't accept excuses for rent. She smiled at every customer. She remembered who took their coffee black and who needed 2 sugars. She carried trays that were heavier than they should have been because Darnell had a bad habit of loading them up. And she never complained because he was 63 years old, and it was getting harder for him to carry things back and forth, and Emily had the energy to compensate, so she did. That was just who she was. The town of Cedar Hollow knew Emily Carter the way small towns know the people who keep things running, not with fanfare, not with speeches, but with the bone-deep familiarity of someone who has simply always been there when needed. She'd worked at Riverside Grill for 6 years. She had served people their first coffee on days they buried spouses in their celebratory pie, on days they married off daughters. She had stayed late during blizzards when roads closed and travelers had nowhere else to go. She had covered shifts when Patty's kids were sick, when Darnell's back went out, when the new girl quit after 3 days without so much as a goodbye note left on the break room table. Emily never complained about any of it, and so nobody paid much attention when she started walking a little differently. Not until Saturday morning when the breakfast rush hit full force and Emily was moving fast. The kind of fast that only comes with years of muscle memory. Trays balanced perfectly. Orders memorized her body, navigating that crowded diner floor, the way a river navigates familiar channels, and the metal strip caught her again. This time was different. Her left foot went sideways. Her ankle twisted with a pop she felt more than heard, and the tray loaded with 2 full plates of eggs, a short stack of pancakes, and a ceramic mug of coffee that was fresh and very hot lurched forward. Emily did something extraordinary in that split second that she would not even remember doing later. She turned the tray into her body instead of letting it fall outward, which meant the coffee splashed against her forearm instead of across the family at table 4, a couple in their 60s, with a little granddaughter who was coloring on a paper placemat and had no idea how close she came to a very bad morning. Emily caught the edge of the counter. Her knuckles went white. The coffee soaked through her sleeve. She stood there for 3 full seconds breathing before she set the tray down on the nearest surface and pressed her other hand to her forearm and just held still. Patty appeared at her elbow from nowhere. Emily, are you? I'm fine. The words came out automatically before the sentence was even finished being asked. I'm totally fine. Just give me a second. But she wasn't fine. And this time someone else saw it. Rachel Dawson had been running Riverside Grill for 11 years. She had opened on days she should have stayed home sick. She had kept the lights on through 2 recessions and 1 catastrophic flood that put 3 inches of water on the main floor and required all of them to mop for 14 hours straight. She was not a woman given to sentiment, and she was not a woman given to drama. And she had seen enough of your workplace nonsense over the decades to have developed a fairly reliable radar for when something was actually wrong versus when someone was simply having a difficult shift. She had been watching Emily for 4 days. She had told herself it was nothing. Emily was tired. Emily had a long week. Emily was probably coming down with something, and she had convinced herself more than once that she was imagining the slight drag in Emily's left step, the way she favored her right side when she thought nobody was looking, the split-second pause she took at the kitchen entrance before pushing through the way a person pauses before stepping through something they know is going to hurt. But that Saturday morning, watching Emily Carter hold herself against the counter with her arm pressed to her chest and her jaw set hard, and her eyes doing that thing they did when she was refusing to let something show, Rachel stopped convincing herself. She crossed the floor. Emily. I'm fine, Rachel. Emily. Rachel's voice was quiet. It was the voice she used when she wasn't asking, not really. Let me see your arm. Emily hesitated. That was the thing that told Rachel everything. Emily didn't hesitate. Emily moved. Emily acted. Emily handled things. When Emily hesitated, something was genuinely wrong. She held out her arm. The skin along the inside of her forearm was red, already starting to model towards something that would be a burn by evening. Rachel looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Emily's face. Then she looked down at Emily's left foot, which was bearing about 30% of the weight it should have been. How long has your ankle been hurting? She asked. It's nothing. Emily. It'll heal, Rachel. It's just a little. How long? Silence. Since Tuesday, Emily said quietly. And just saying it out loud, just letting those 2 words exist in the air between them, seemed to take something out of her. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Her chin lowered. I reported the floor strip. I told Calvin. I wrote it on the maintenance log last Friday, but nothing got fixed and I didn't want to make it a bigger thing than it was, so I just kept watching my step. Rachel felt something move through her that she recognized as guilt and anger, arriving at the same moment, which was an uncomfortable combination. She breathed through it. Sit down, she said. The tables. Patty has the tables. Sit down, sweetheart. Emily sat. And that right there, that single act of sitting down when someone told her to, instead of insisting she was fine and picking up the next tray, told Rachel just how much Emily had been carrying. A woman who ran on stubbornness alone didn't stop moving until she had nothing left to run on. Rachel sat across from her in the small booth near the back window, the one they used for employee breaks. She looked at Emily for a moment, 27 years old. Blonde hair pulled back tight because loose hair was a health code violation she took seriously even when other girls on the floor got away with it. Eyes that were greenish gray and direct, except for right now when they were pointed at the table. "Is there someone I can call for you?" Rachel asked. "I don't need anyone called." "That wasn't what I asked." Emily pressed her lips together. Outside, a truck rolled by on the highway, its rumble settling into the walls the way it always did, that familiar vibration that had been the background sound of Emily's working life for 6 years. "My brother," Emily said finally. "Jackson." But she looked up. "Only if you promise he comes here to help, not to start a fight." Rachel had heard about Jackson Carter the way everyone in Cedar Hollow had heard about Jackson Carter, in fragments and half sentences, in the particular way people talked about someone whose reputation traveled faster than his motorcycle. He was Emily's older brother. He was 42. He had been riding with the Hells Angels for more than 2 decades. He had a face that looked like weather-lined and sun-roughed and severe in the way of someone who had been outdoors through all 4 seasons for most of his adult life. He was not someone people approached casually at gas stations. He was not someone who got pulled into the kind of conversations that started with, "I don't mean any offense, but..." He was also, by every account that Rachel had ever collected from people who actually knew him, rather than just feared him, someone who would walk through fire for the people he loved without hesitation and without making a production of it. Rachel nodded. "I'll call him," she said. "And Emily," the young woman looked up. "You should have told me Tuesday." Emily's jaw tightened. "I didn't want to be the person who makes everything harder. Making sure the floor doesn't injure my employees is not harder. That's just my job." Emily didn't answer that. She looked back at the table. Her fingers curled around the edge of it, the same way her hand had curled around the counter, holding steady, the way she always held on, because letting go had never felt like something she was allowed to do. Rachel stood up, took her phone from her apron pocket, and walked toward the back of the diner to make the call. Behind her, Emily stared out the window. She had spent 6 years in this building. She had memorized every crack in the ceiling above table 12, every wobble in the bar stool at the counter's far end, every particular quirk of the old coffee machine that meant you had to press the handle down firmly or it would leak. She knew this place the way she knew her own apartment, maybe better. She had given it her whole self shift after shift, season after season, smiling through fatigue and aching through pain and never once letting anyone see the cost of it. And for what? So her ankle could swell inside her boot, while a note she'd written and had unread on a maintenance log, and her manager told her to watch her step. She pressed her forearm against the cool edge of the table and breathed. From the other side of the diner, she could hear Patty handling the tables, could hear her own regulars, the truckers and farmers and early morning travelers she had taken care of for years, asking Patty where Emily was. She could hear Patty saying she was taking a short break. She could hear old Roy Hutchins at counter seat 3 saying, "She okay, she's been walking funny all week." All week. He had noticed all week. He had noticed all week and said nothing. And she had noticed all week and said almost nothing. And Calvin had been told and said nothing meaningful. And the floor had kept sitting there with its sharp metal edge, waiting for the next body that walked through it. And now her arm was burned and her ankle was swollen, and she was sitting in a break booth for the first time in 6 years, listening to her boss call her biker brother at 8:15 on a Saturday morning. She closed her eyes. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Rachel say, "Jackson, this is Rachel Dawson over at Riverside Grill. I'm calling about Emily." A pause, then, "Yes, she's safe, but I need you to come." Emily opened her eyes. She had not cried in this diner in 6 years. She had come close a few times after a double shift that stretched 14 hours when she was running a low fever, after a table of young guys who'd said things that weren't worth repeating. After one particular Thanksgiving when the entire afternoon rush came in at once, and she dropped a pie that had taken her 20 minutes to slice and plate perfectly, and she'd had to go to the walk-in cooler for 60 seconds just to press her forehead to the shelf and breathe. But she had never cried. She was not going to cry now. She pulled her apron off and set it on the table in front of her and stared at it. The cotton was faded in the pockets from all the times she'd shoved her order pad in and out throughout the day. There was a small stain near the lower hem from a ketchup incident 3 months ago that hadn't quite washed out. Her name was embroidered on the front in green thread. Rachel had done that for all her servers the previous Christmas, a small gesture that had meant more than Rachel probably realized. Emily. Just her name, nothing else. She ran her thumb across the letters. She had not asked Jackson for help since she was 21, when her car had broken down on a highway at midnight, and she'd had no choice. Even then, she had felt guilty making the call. She had spent the entire time he drove out to her, sitting on the guardrail, telling herself she needed to be better about her car maintenance, as if the breakdown were a personal failure rather than just a mechanical event. That was the thing about being the sister of someone as capable and steady as Jackson Carter. It didn't make you feel protected. It made you feel like you had to earn the right to his protection, had to prove the situation was truly bad enough to justify asking for it. Because if you called Jackson, Jackson came. And when Jackson came, he came fully, his full attention, his full presence, the full weight of who he was bearing down on whatever problem you'd called him about. That wasn't a small thing. That wasn't something you deployed over a twisted ankle in an unchecked maintenance log. Except her ankle wasn't just twisted, and the maintenance log had been sitting there for 8 days. And her forearm was going to blister by tomorrow morning. And she had almost dumped a pot of hot coffee on a 6-year-old girl who was coloring a placemat because she'd thought watching her step was a sufficient solution to a structural problem that should have been fixed before it ever became her problem in the first place. She heard Rachel's footsteps coming back down the hall. "He's coming," Rachel said simply. Emily nodded. She kept her eyes on the apron. "How long?" she asked. "Maybe 40 minutes. He was already on this side of the county." 40 minutes. Emily picked up her apron and set it aside. She straightened in the seat. "I need to go check on table 7, she said. Emily, "Oh, I can sit at the counter if you don't want me on the floor, but I'm not sitting in this booth for 40 minutes. Rachel looked at her for a long moment. "Counter," she said, "and you're keeping weight off that ankle." Emily slid out of the booth. She was already adjusting, already compensating, shifting her weight, finding the posture that would let her function. It was automatic. It was muscle memory. It was 27 years of understanding that the world expected you to keep moving regardless of the condition you were in. But there was something different about walking back out to the counter now. Something had shifted, not in her ankle, not in her arm, but somewhere in the part of her that had been holding all of it alone. She had said it out loud. She had sat down. She had made the call, or rather she had said the name of the person to call, which was close enough to asking for help as she had ever come. The diner was humming with its usual morning energy. The smell of coffee and bacon and hot griddle was the same as always. The light coming through the front windows was the same February pale winter light she'd looked at 1,000 Saturday mornings. Patty was moving efficiently between tables, and Darnell was calling from the kitchen, and Roy Hutchins was still at counter seat 3 with his second cup of coffee. And when Emily slid onto the stool at the end of the counter, he looked at her over the rim of his mug and said, "There she is. You okay, Em?" "I'll be all right, Roy," she said. He nodded slowly. His hands were wrapped around the mug the way old men hold their coffee cups, like warmth itself is the point, not the caffeine. He had been coming to this diner for probably 15 years. He had watched Emily grow from an uncertain 21-year-old who still apologized when she got an order slightly wrong into the steadiest person in the building. He knew her the way regulars know the people who take care of them, not deeply but truly. "Your brother coming?" he asked. She looked at him. "Word travels," he said with the unashamed ease of a small-town man who had never once pretended that small towns were private places. "Yeah," Emily said. "He's coming." Roy nodded again, set his cup down. "Good," he said simply, and picked up his newspaper. Emily looked at the door. 40 minutes. It felt like a very long time. And it also felt in some way she wasn't quite ready to examine yet, like the end of something and the beginning of something else, the way certain mornings have a quality to them that you only recognize in retrospect as the morning everything changed. She pressed her hand to the counter and breathed. Outside, the highway stretched north and south through the mountains, and somewhere out there, Jackson Carter was already riding. Coming not because she had broken down or given up. Coming because someone had finally called and she had finally let them. The coffee machine beeped. Patty called a number. The door opened and a family of 4 came in from the cold, shaking snow off their jackets, the kids already arguing about who got the window seat. Emily didn't get up. For the first time in 6 years, she sat still and waited for her brother to come. The 40 minutes passed the way certain kinds of waiting always do, not as slowly, not quickly, but with a particular texture that made every sound sharper than it needed to be, and every second feel like it had weight. Emily sat at the counter and drank half a cup of coffee she didn't taste, and watch the door without watching it, which is a skill you develop when you've spent years not wanting people to know what you're waiting for. Patty came by twice to check on her phone. The first time Emily said she was fine. The second time, Patty didn't say anything, just refilled her coffee and squeezed her shoulder briefly and moved on, which was exactly the right thing to do. And Emily made a mental note to tell her that later. Darnell leaned out from the kitchen once and looked at her with his thick eyebrows raised in a question, and she gave him a small nod and he retreated back to his grill without pressing it. Roy Hutchins finished his paper and ordered a slice of pie and ate it with the slow dignity of a man who had nowhere else to be and no intention of pretending otherwise. The family of four settled into a booth. The kids stopped arguing. The parents ordered pancakes. Life moved forward the way it always did, indifferent to the particular weight Emily Carter was carrying on her stool at the end of the counter. And then the door opened. She felt it before she saw it. Not the cold air, though, that came with it, but the particular shift in atmosphere that happens when a room changes its center of gravity. Conversations didn't stop. Nobody dropped a fork. There was no dramatic moment of silence. But something moved through the diner like a current moving through water, subtle and immediate, and heads turned toward the entrance, with the instinct of people who have learned to track certain presences without quite knowing why. Jackson Carter walked in first. He was exactly as Emily remembered, and simultaneously more than she'd prepared herself for. He was in his riding gear, heavy jacket, worn jeans, boots that had covered more miles than most people drove in a decade. His blonde hair was pulled back tight, a few silver threads through it, now that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him, and his face carried its usual expression, which wasn't quite a scowl and wasn't quite a frown, but was simply the face of a man who didn't bother arranging his features for other people's comfort. He was big in the way of men who worked physical lives, not gym-built, but road-built, dense and practical. Behind him came three others. She recognized Trace, who was Jackson's oldest road brother and had a laugh like a cement truck and eyes that missed nothing. Then Marcus, who was younger than the other two, but carried himself with the same settled authority. Then a man she didn't know by name, stocky and dark-haired, who scanned the room with professional efficiency before settling into a relaxed stance near the door. The diner noticed them. Of course it did. But what the diner noticed, what registered in the small recalibrations happening at every table, was not aggression. It was the absence of it. Because when you're expecting someone to come in swinging, and instead they come in quiet, that quietness lands harder than noise ever could. Jackson's eyes found Emily immediately. She didn't look away. He crossed the diner floor without hurry, without theater, with the same unhurried deliberateness he'd had since she was a child, the walk of a man who had decided on his direction and saw no reason to perform the act of getting there. He pulled out the stool beside her and sat down. He didn't touch her. He didn't make a speech. He looked at her forearm first, the redness visible below her pushed-up sleeve, and then at the way she was holding her left leg, and then at her face. "Hey, Em," he said. "Hey, Jackson." That was it. That was the whole reunion. It would have seemed cold to someone who didn't know them. To anyone who did, it was everything, a whole conversation compressed into 4 syllables, because the Carter siblings had always communicated in the language of what didn't need to be said. "Your arm," he said. "Coffee. I'm fine. Your leg, ankle. I'll live." He looked at her for one more second. Then he said very quietly, "Where?" She knew what he was asking. Not who, not why, just where. Where is the thing that hurt you? Show me the physical fact of it, because Jackson Carter had always been a man who needed to see a thing with his own eyes before he could begin to think about what to do about it. "Kitchen entrance," she said. "Floor strip. It's been lifting for over a week." He nodded. He turned on his stool toward Rachel, who had been standing a careful distance away, close enough to be present, far enough to give them their moment, and introduced himself with his last name, only the way people do when they assume you already know who they are, and they're not wrong. "Carter," he said. "You're the owner. Rachel Dawson. I own and manage." She extended her hand. He shook it. "Can I see the floor?" "Of course." Rachel glanced at Emily. "Do you want to, "I'll come," Emily said, and slid off the stool before anyone could offer to help her. She led them back through the diner, Jackson beside her, Trace, and Marcus following at a respectful distance, the fourth man still near the door, and she was acutely aware of the way the room tracked their movement. Not with fear, she thought. More like the way people watch something they don't quite have a category for yet. Cedar Hollow knew about Jackson Carter in theory. This was the first time most of these people were seeing him in practice. They stopped at the kitchen entrance. The metal strip was right there, plain as anything. The edge was lifted at a sharp angle, the kind of thing that once you saw it, you couldn't understand how anyone had walked past it without acting. And yet that was exactly what had happened. Dozens of people had walked past it every single day because dangerous things that don't announce themselves tend to become wallpaper. You stop registering them. You adapt around them. You tell yourself it's not that bad, it'll get fixed. Someone else will handle it. Watch your step. Jackson crouched down beside it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He pressed his thumb against the lifted edge. It flexed up another quarter-inch under the pressure. A loose screw was visible at the far end, the hole stripped out so the screw no longer held anything. "How long has this screw been gone?" he asked. Rachel leaned over to look. Her jaw tightened. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Who's your maintenance contact?" "We handle most things in-house. Calvin, my floor manager, coordinates repairs." Jackson stood up. He looked at Emily. "You said you reported this." "Last Friday, maintenance log, and I told Calvin directly on Tuesday morning." Jackson turned to Rachel. Rachel's expression had moved into a territory that Emily recognized as the place between professional composure and genuine anger, the narrow corridor a person walks when they're realizing in real time that something happened on their watch that shouldn't have. "I wasn't aware it had been reported," Rachel said, and there was something careful and deliberate in the way she said it that told Emily she was being precise with her words on purpose. "Where's Calvin now?" Jackson asked. Rachel looked at the clock on the wall. "He should be in by 9. Jackson looked at his watch. 20 minutes, and he said, "Yes." He nodded slowly. He looked at the floor strip again. Then he looked at Emily's arm, then her leg, in the same calm, sequential way he'd been doing since he sat down beside her at the counter, cataloging, assessing, not reacting but processing. "You got a toolbox on the premises?" he asked Rachel. She blinked. "We do, yes. And replacement screws standard size. In the utility closet probably. I'd have to check." "Check," he said, not rudely, just directly. Rachel went to check. Emily looked at her brother. "Jackson." "I'm not going to lose my temper," he said before she could finish. "That's not what I was going to say." "What were you going to say about it?" She hesitated. "I was going to say thank you for coming." Something shifted in his face. It was subtle, a fraction of softening around his eyes, the particular adjustment of a man who doesn't do sentiment easily, but feels it deeply. He looked at her for a moment. "You know, you could have called me Tuesday," he said. "I know. Or Wednesday. I know, Jackson. Or any of the 6 days before today." "I know." She looked at the floor. "I didn't want to be the one who needed saving." He was quiet for a moment. Trace and Marcus had stepped back, giving them space with the tact of men who understood when to become part of the background. From the kitchen, Darnell glanced out through the pass-through window, caught Emily's eye, and gave her a thumbs up that was so earnest and so Darnell that it almost made her laugh. "There's a difference," Jackson said finally, "between needing saving and needing backup." She looked up at him. "Saving is when you're helpless," he said. "Backup is when you're not helpless. You're just outnumbered. You were never helpless, Em. You just didn't have anyone standing beside you." He paused. "That's what I'm here for." She pressed her lips together. She would not cry in this kitchen entrance. She had decided that already. Rachel came back from the utility closet with a small toolbox and a handful of screws sorted into her palm. "Found these," she said. "Not sure if the size is right." Jackson took one and crouched back down to the floor strip, comparing the screw to the stripped hole. "Little large," he said, "but I've got what I need on the bike." He stood, handed the screw back to Rachel, and walked toward the front entrance. No announcement, no explanation, just movement, the kind of movement that meant something was happening now, not later. Trace looked at Emily with a mild expression. "He's been like this since he was 19, he said. "Sees a problem, fixes the problem." "I know," Emily said. "I grew up with him." Trace almost smiled. "Right, you did." He looked toward the front. "He talked about you a lot when we were riding through this part of the state. Said his sister worked a diner out in Cedar Hollow and made the best pie he'd ever eaten." Emily blinked. "He said that every time we came anywhere near Montana." Trace shrugged. "Man doesn't talk much. When he does, you listen." Jackson came back in 2 minutes with a small kit from his saddlebag. He didn't ask anyone to move aside. He simply moved to the floor, settled into a crouch that looked practiced, and started working. His hands were steady. He worked without commentary, without audience playing, with the efficient focus of someone who had been fixing things his whole life and found performance unnecessary. Rachel stood beside Emily and they both watched him. "He's not what I expected," Rachel said quietly. "He never is," Emily said. The screw went in cleanly. Jackson tested the strip pressing and lifting, checking the give. He made one adjustment, tested it again. Then he put his tools back and said, "Temporary fix. You'll want a professional to look at the full seam before the week is out. This section should hold in the meantime." Rachel nodded. "I'll call someone Monday morning. Today would be better." A beat. Today. Rachel agreed, and that was when they heard the back door. Calvin Brooks came in the way he always did on Saturday mornings, coffee in hand, phone out, already looking at something on the screen that wasn't the room he'd just walked into. He was a man in his mid-40s who wore his authority loosely the way people do when they've held a position long enough that they've stopped remembering what it felt like not to have it. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had learned that small problems in busy places tended to resolve themselves if you waited long enough. And he had applied this philosophy broadly with results that had worked out more often than not, which had made him more confident in the philosophy than the evidence warranted. He looked up from his phone and registered the scene in front of him. Rachel standing with her arms crossed, Emily beside her, and 4 men in Hell's Angels cuts, taking up space in his kitchen entrance. And his face did something complicated and quick, before it settled back into something that was trying very hard to look composed. "Rachel," he said, carefully. "Calvin," she said, not carefully at all. He looked at the men. He looked at Emily. He looked at the floor. And Emily watched the exact moment when he recognized the floor strip, the repaired floor strip, and understood what he was looking at. "I can explain," he started. "In a minute," Rachel said. "Right now I want to show you something." She walked to the maintenance log binder that lived on the shelf beside the kitchen pass-through. She opened it to the previous Friday's page. She turned it around and held it out toward Calvin so he could see it clearly. Emily's handwriting: "Floor strip at kitchen entrance lifting, creating tripping hazard. Reported to supervisor. Requesting immediate repair." And her name and the date and the time. 8 days ago, Calvin looked at it. The diner had gotten quieter than usual. Darnell had stopped moving at the grill. Patty had drifted closer to the kitchen entrance, not obviously, but close enough. At the counter, Roy Hutchins had set down his newspaper. The family of 4 in the booth nearest the kitchen had 2 kids who were still eating their pancakes, but both parents had their heads slightly turned. Nobody was pretending not to notice anymore. "I saw it," Calvin said. His voice had lost some of its rehearsed steadiness. "I assessed it and determined it wasn't an immediate." "She reported it verbally to you on Tuesday," Rachel said. "She reported it in writing the Friday before that. And she has been walking on a damaged ankle for 6 days because the floor wasn't fixed. I told her to watch her step." "Calvin." Rachel's voice didn't rise. It just became flatter, and somehow that was worse. "She almost dropped hot coffee on a child this morning. She has a burn on her arm right now. She has been limping through her shifts for a week and compensating so nobody would know because she was afraid of looking weak for reporting something that should have been fixed in 24 hours. The silence after that was the kind that had density. Calvin looked at Emily. Emily looked back at him. For the first time in 6 days of interactions with this man, she didn't look away first. She didn't soften her expression. She didn't manufacture a smile or adjust her posture to make herself smaller. She simply stood there and looked at him and let him see what 6 days of unnecessary pain looked like on a person's face when that person finally stopped hiding it. Calvin cleared his throat. "Emily, I need you to understand something," Emily said. Her voice surprised her. It came out steady in a way she hadn't rehearsed, the steadiness of someone who has finally run out of reasons to be anything other than honest. "I didn't report that floor because I wanted special treatment. I reported it because it was dangerous. Not just to me, to everyone who works this floor. Patty walks through there. Darnell walks through there when he brings plates to the pass-through. The new girl we hired last month walks through there on her first week. I reported it because that's what you're supposed to do. And I kept walking through it because I didn't want to be difficult. And now I have a burn and a sprained ankle, and I almost hurt a child. And the only reason any of this matters today, instead of next Tuesday, is because my brother came." She stopped. "Let that breathe. Then, that's a problem, and it's not mine." Calvin looked like a man who had swallowed something sideways. Jackson had not moved. He had not said a single word since Calvin entered. He had simply stood there, not menacingly, not performing presence, but there in that stillness, that complete absence of the explosion, whom everyone might have expected, turned out to be far more powerful than any explosion could have been. Because you can dismiss noise. You cannot dismiss a man who stands in silence and lets the truth do the work. "I owe you an apology," Calvin said finally. And something about the way he said it suggested it cost him something real. Not enough, not nearly enough, but something. "I underestimated what you reported. I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry for what it cost you." Emily nodded once. She wasn't magnanimous about it, wasn't warm and forgiving and tell him it's okay. She simply nodded and let the apology sit there. Rachel spoke. "Calvin, I need to talk to you in the office. Give me 5 minutes." Calvin nodded and disappeared through the staff hallway door. Rachel looked at Emily, and in that look was a whole conversation that didn't need words, a promise, an acknowledgement, a reckoning that was happening on Emily's behalf even now. "Go sit down," Rachel said gently. "I'll be out shortly." Emily turned back toward the diner floor. Jackson fell into step beside her. They walked back to the counter together, and Emily climbed onto her stool, and Jackson settled onto the one beside her, and Trace and Marcus drifted toward the booth nearby, without being asked the practiced behavior of men who knew how to take up exactly the right amount of space. The fourth man near the door had ordered coffee. At some point, Emily noticed the cup and was reading the small community board on the wall with the same relaxed attention he'd given the room earlier. Darnell leaned out from the kitchen window. He looked at Emily, then at Jackson, then back at Emily. He pointed at Jackson and then gave a double thumbs up, both hands the most enthusiastic, silent endorsement Emily had ever received in this kitchen. Jackson glanced at the window. "The cook, Darnell, he's been here longer than I have. He makes good pancakes. Best in the county." Jackson looked at the menu board above the counter. "I haven't eaten since 6. Emily looked at him. "You drove out here without eating." "Got the call, came." She held his gaze for a second. "Jackson, it's not a big deal, Em. You drove 40 minutes without eating because Rachel called you." He shrugged, which was the Jackson Carter equivalent of an entire speech about family loyalty. She knew that. She'd known it since she was 12 years old, and he'd driven 3 hours in a snowstorm to bring her medicine when she had the flu and their mother couldn't leave work. She turned toward the kitchen window. "Darnell, can we get a short stack and 2 eggs scrambled, salt and pepper coffee?" Darnell's voice came back, coming right up. "You didn't ask what I wanted," Jackson said. "You've ordered the same breakfast your entire life." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, because Jackson didn't smile the way other people smiled, but the particular arrangement of his features that meant he was closer to warm than usual. "You still remember that?" "I remember everything," she said. "I just don't talk about most of it." He set his coffee mug down. "You should have called me," he said again, but differently this time. Not a reprimand, just a fact delivered quietly the way you say something that's been sitting in you since you walked through the door. "I know. You've been in pain for 6 days. I've been in worse. That's not the point." "I know it's not." She looked at her hands on the counter. "I didn't want you to think I couldn't handle things. I've known you for 27 years, Emily. I have never once thought you couldn't handle things." He paused. "The question was never about whether you could handle it alone. The question was whether you should have to." The diner moved around them. Coffee was poured. An order was called. The front door opened and closed as a new customer came in. The ordinary machinery of a Saturday morning ground forward, indifferent and continuous. Emily breathed. "Trace said you talk about me when you're riding through Montana," she said. Jackson picked up his coffee, said nothing. "He said you tell people I make the best pie. Trace talks too much. Is it true?" A long pause. "Your cherry pie is legitimately exceptional," Jackson said, with the particular stiffness of a man who finds sincere compliments embarrassing. "I've had pie in 14 states. That's a fact." Emily laughed. It was the first real laugh she'd had in 6 days, and it came out a little ragged and a little louder than she'd intended. And Roy Hutchins looked over from his stool and gave her a satisfied nod. And Darnell hollered in, "There she is from the kitchen." And for just a moment, the whole weight of the past week shifted off her shoulders just slightly. Not gone, not resolved, but lighter, the way things get when you stop carrying them completely alone. Jackson looked at her when she laughed. That same, almost not quite a smile. "You should do that more often," he said. "Laugh. Look like yourself." She stopped. That landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She looked at him, and for a moment she was 12 again, and 14 again, and 21 on the side of a highway, every version of herself that had ever needed her brother and not known how to say so. "I've been trying to look like I was fine," she admitted. "I know. For a long time. I know that too." He set down his mug. You don't have to perform fine for me. You never did. You were always the person who had it together, yeah? But you were also always my little sister. Those two things can coexist." She pressed her lips together, looked at the counter, breathed through it. "Darnell's going to burn your eggs if he gets emotional," she said. "He seems like the type." "He absolutely is. From the kitchen, I heard that. And the eggs are perfect." They both looked toward the pass-through. Darnell's face appeared in the window, indignant and warm in equal measure, already sliding a plate through. Jackson reached over and pulled it toward him and picked up a fork with the straightforward hunger of a man who had been writing since before sunrise. Emily watched him. She thought about the maintenance log. She thought about Calvin's face when Rachel turned it toward him. She thought about the stripped screw on the floor and the screws Jackson had kept in his saddlebag, and the 40 minutes she had spent at this counter preparing herself for whatever this visit would be. She had expected confrontation. She had expected someone to need managing. Instead, her brother had walked in, crouched on a floor, fixed what needed fixing, stood without spectacle, while the truth was spoken, and then sat beside her and asked for scrambled eggs. That was the thing people never understood about Jackson Carter. The thing Cedar Hollow thought it understood from his reputation and clearly didn't. He wasn't here to be impressive. He wasn't here to dominate the room or assert anything about power. He was here because his sister had finally let someone make a call, and that was enough reason for him to come every single time. Rachel emerged from the staff hallway about 15 minutes later. She walked to the counter and sat on Emily's other side, which meant Emily was flanked her boss on one side, her brother on the other, and under any other circumstances that might have felt like being managed, but right now it just felt like being held. "Calvin and I have had our conversation," Rachel said. She addressed Emily directly, not Jackson, which was the right call, and Emily noticed it. "Effective immediately, any reported hazard in this building gets flagged and addressed within 24 hours. I'm putting it in writing as policy. If it's not corrected in 24 hours, it gets escalated to me personally, no exceptions." Emily nodded. "I'm also scheduling you for this coming week with reduced closing shifts so you can rest your ankle properly. Full pay, non-negotiable." "Rachel, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." Rachel's voice was firm and kind in the same breath. "What happened this week shouldn't have happened. The floor should have been fixed. The report should have been acted on. You should not have had to keep working through pain because a repair got ignored. I can't take back the last 6 days, but I can make sure the next 6 days are different." Emily sat with that for a moment. "Okay," she said quietly. Rachel looked past Emily at Jackson. "Thank you for coming." Jackson set down his fork. "She's my sister," he said, as if this explained everything, which to him it absolutely did. "I know," Rachel said, "but you came with tools instead of trouble. That matters." Jackson looked at her for a moment. Then he picked his fork back up, which from Jackson Carter was as close to acknowledging a compliment as you were going to get. Rachel stood. "I need to make some calls." She squeezed Emily's shoulder, once a quick, firm squeeze that said more than it seemed, and walked away. At the front of the diner, the family of 4 was finishing up. The dad was looking at the counter where Emily and Jackson sat, and Emily caught his eye for just a moment, and he gave her a small nod, the nod of someone who had watched something happen and knew what it was, even if he couldn't have put it into words. Then he went back to asking his kids if they wanted anything else. Roy Hutchins had ordered a 3rd cup of coffee, which was unusual for him. He was staying. Emily understood that. He was staying because this was Cedar Hollow, and something was happening at Riverside Grill that was going to be talked about for months, and Roy Hutchins had been a witness from the start and had no intention of not seeing it through to whatever came next. Trace leaned over from the neighboring booth. "Jackson," he said, "this pie Emily makes, is it on the menu today?" Jackson didn't look up from his eggs. "Ask her yourself." Trace looked at Emily with his big warm eyes and the beginnings of that cement truck laugh. "Emily, is the legendary cherry pie available today?" Emily looked at him, then at Jackson. Jackson kept eating and said nothing, which was definitely his version of saying everything. "It's not cherry season," Emily said, "but I made a peach yesterday that I think holds up." Trace's face lit up. "Darnell," Emily called. "Already cutting," came the answer from the kitchen. Marcus looked over from his spot at the end of the counter. "Do I get a slice?" "How many of you are there?" Emily asked. "4. "Darnell," Emily called again. I heard 4 slices, 4 forks, keep your aprons on." And somewhere in that moment, in the warmth of pie being cut and coffee being poured, and her brother eating scrambled eggs on the stool beside her, and Roy Hutchins making absolutely no moves toward the door, something inside Emily Carter that had been rigid for 6 days, maybe longer, maybe years longer than 6 days, began to loosen just slightly. Not break, not dissolve, just ease. The way a fist unclenches, the way a shoulder drops, the way a breath comes out a little fuller than the one before it. She picked up her own coffee. Outside the front windows, the mountains stood exactly where they'd always been, white-capped, and permanent and cold and enormous, the way they'd been standing since before this diner existed, before Cedar Hollow existed, before any of them had lives that needed to be held together by work and pride, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided too early that needing help was the same as being helpless. The mountains didn't care about any of it. But the people in this diner, the regulars and the strangers, and the cook who was being emotional over pie, and the 4 men in leather cuts, and the boss who was making calls in the back office, they cared. And Emily was starting slowly to let that count for something. The pie arrived in 4 slices and the coffee stayed hot, and for about 20 minutes Riverside Grill felt almost normal, or at least a version of normal that had 4 Hell's Angels sitting at the counter and in the corner booth eating peach pie on a Saturday morning, while a waitress with a burned forearm and a wrapped ankle tried to remember what it felt like to breathe without bracing for impact. It was Trace who noticed first. He was on his second cup of coffee fork, scraping the last of the peach, filling off his plate, when he looked up and went still in the particular way of a man whose instincts have been sharpened by years of reading rooms. His eyes moved to the front window, then to Jackson. "We've got an audience," he said, quiet, even. Jackson didn't turn immediately. He took one more sip of his coffee, set the mug down with deliberate calm, and then looked. 3 men had parked outside. Emily felt the shift before she understood it, that same change in atmospheric pressure she'd felt when Jackson first walked in, except reversed, now running in the wrong direction. She followed Trace's gaze and saw them through the glass. She didn't recognize them, not by name, but she recognized the type. Men who came into diners looking for something that had nothing to do with breakfast. Their body language was the language of people who had decided something before they arrived. Roy Hutchins set his coffee mug down very carefully. Darnell, who had been humming something to himself at the grill, stopped humming. Patty appeared at Emily's elbow and said nothing, but her hand found Emily's arm and held it. The door opened. The man who came in first was maybe 50, heavy-set, wearing a jacket with a local bar's logo on the back that Emily had seen before on men who came in smelling like last night and looking for somewhere to park their attitude. He scanned the diner the way you scan a room when you're looking for a specific thing, and when he found it, when his eyes landed on Jackson, his face did something that was halfway between a smirk and a challenge. "Heard there was some kind of situation over here," he said, to nobody in particular, to everybody. His 2 friends flanked him just inside the door. One of them was younger, late 20s maybe, with a particular aggressive energy of someone who had learned that standing near an intimidating person made him feel more solid. The other was older, quieter, and the quiet one worried Emily more than either of the others. Jackson turned on his stool. He turned slowly, completely unhurried, and looked at the 3 men with an expression that was entirely neutral. Not threatening, not welcoming, just present. The look of a man who has seen this specific kind of entrance many times and has long since stopped finding it interesting. "No situation," Jackson said. "Just having breakfast." "Funny," the heavy-set man said. Because the way I heard it, a bunch of out-of-town writers came into a local business to push people around. Emily felt Patty's grip on her arm tighten. Marcus had stopped eating. He hadn't moved anything else, hadn't shifted his weight, hadn't tensed visibly, but he had stopped eating, and that stillness was its own kind of statement. The fourth man, the one who'd been near the door since they arrived, the one Emily still didn't know by name, turned from the community board he'd been reading and looked at the newcomers with an expression of mild interest, the way you look at weather you knew was coming. Nobody pushed anybody, Rachel said from behind the counter. Everyone looked at her. She had emerged from the hallway at the wrong moment or the exactly right moment, depending on how you looked at it, and she was standing with her arms at her sides and her chin up and the particular expression of a woman who has run a business for 11 years through floods and recessions and difficult customers and was not about to be theater in someone else's performance. "This is my diner," she said. "These men are my guests. If you're here to eat, I'll get you a table. If you're here for something else, I need you to leave." The heavy-set man looked at her. His smirk adjusted slightly, recalibrating for an audience he hadn't expected to have to account for. "Just checking on things," he said. "Small town, people talk." "People do talk," Rachel agreed pleasantly. "They'll be talking about this too. So let's make sure there's something worth talking about." She tilted her head. "Menus on the board. Peach pie is highly recommended this morning." It was such a perfectly calibrated response, so completely refusing to give the confrontation the gravity it was trying to claim, that it took the air out of the room in a way that aggression never could have. Emily felt the corner of her mouth pull despite herself. Trace was definitely smiling now. He hid it in his coffee cup, but not very well. The heavy-set man looked at Jackson again, searching for the confrontation that kept not materializing. Jackson met his eyes. "I'm going to say this once," Jackson said. His voice was the same, even unhurried tone he'd used for everything that morning. No performance, no heat, just the plain delivery of a man who didn't need volume to be heard. "My sister works here. She got hurt because a safety problem was ignored. I came to see what happened and to help if I could. That's the whole story. There's nothing here for you." A beat. "Your sister," the man repeated, and something shifted in his face, a recalculation happening. The slow reassembly of a narrative he'd walked in with that was not matching the room. "My sister," Jackson said, 27 years old, "been working this floor for 6 years. He paused. "She reported a hazard 8 days ago. Nobody fixed it. She sprained her ankle and burned her arm this morning trying to keep a pot of hot coffee off a child's head." Another pause shorter. "That's why I'm here. Not for you, not for whatever story you heard on the way over." The room was very still. Emily was aware of Roy Hutchins watching from his stool with the careful attention of a man composing the story in his head as it happened. She was aware of the family of 4. The parents had their children pulled slightly closer than necessary, not frightened exactly, but alert in the way parents get when a room changes temperature. She was aware of Darnell in the kitchen, who she could feel through the pass-through window even without looking, could feel him standing there, holding a spatula, and ready to do absolutely nothing useful with it but present nonetheless. The heavy-set man looked at Emily. She looked back at him. "Your arm," he said. "My arm," she confirmed. She held it up slightly, the redness visible. "Coffee this morning because I've been compensating on a bad ankle for 6 days and my balance went." She let that sit for a second. "The floor's fixed now. Rachel's putting in a new policy." Calvin apologized. "That's where we are." Something moved across the man's face. It wasn't the dramatic unraveling of someone suddenly seeing the error of their ways. People didn't work like that. Not in 60 seconds flat in the middle of a diner. But it was something, a small deflation. The particular expression of someone who drove somewhere, expecting to find a fight, and found instead something too ordinary and too human to push against. Calvin said there was some kind of altercation, the man said, and already his voice had less of its initial momentum. "Calvin said that," Rachel asked, and the pleasant tone was gone, replaced by something considerably sharper. She pulled out her phone. "Interesting, because Calvin is currently in my office." She typed something, sent it, and 30 seconds later, the door to the staff hallway opened. Calvin appeared. He looked at the 3 men by the door. Something crossed his face, surprise, then a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment. He had clearly not expected this to happen. He had clearly said something to someone at some point in the last hour that had set this in motion, and he was now watching the consequences of that walk through the door, and it was not by any reading of his expression what he had intended. "Calvin," Rachel said, "these gentlemen say they heard there was an altercation here this morning. Do you know anything about that?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened all day. Calvin looked at the men. He looked at Rachel. He looked briefly at Emily, and in that look, Emily saw something she hadn't seen from him before, not defiance, not defensiveness, but the raw discomfort of a man caught between the thing he'd said and the room he'd said it about. He looked like a man holding something that had just become too hot to keep holding. "I may have," he started, stopped. "I called Mike to give him a heads up. I didn't mean for—" "You called someone," Rachel said. "Flat. You called someone to come here. Not to cause trouble. Calvin," her voice could have cut glass. "We are going to have a second conversation today. A longer one." The heavy-set man Mike apparently was looking at Calvin now, with the expression of someone realizing he'd been handed incomplete information and walked into a situation on the basis of it. "You said they were pushing you around," he said. Calvin said nothing. "Were they?" Mike asked. More nothing. Emily watched her floor manager stand in the entrance of the staff hallway and be unable to produce a single word in the face of that question, and she understood in that moment that the most significant thing that had happened today wasn't the floor repair, or Rachel's new policy, or even Jackson's arrival. It was this moment right here where the truth had gotten so specific and so visible that there was simply no story left that could cover it. "Nobody pushed anybody," Jackson said again. The same words he'd said 5 minutes ago, delivered with the same patience, as if he was perfectly willing to keep saying it as many times as the room needed to hear it. "The floor was fixed. Apologies were given. We're eating pie." He turned back to the counter. He picked up his coffee mug. "You're welcome to join us." It was such an absurd ending to the scene that Mike stood there for a full 3 seconds just processing it. Then he looked at his two friends. The younger one shrugged, helpless. The quiet older one was already looking at the menu board. "That peach pie," the older one said. He looked at Rachel. "Is it made here? Made fresh yesterday?" Rachel said. He nodded. "We'll take 3 slices and 3 coffees." He looked at his friends. "Come on." Mike stood for one more moment. Then he pulled out a chair at the nearest table and sat down, and the young one sat beside him, and just like that, the confrontation that had arrived like a weather system dissolved into exactly what Rachel had offered it from the start. Just a table, just some coffee, just a Saturday morning in a Montana diner where things had gotten complicated and then, against all reasonable expectation, had gotten simpler. Darnell's face appeared in the kitchen window. He looked at the 3 new customers. He looked at Jackson. He looked at Emily. Then he held up 3 fingers in a question. "3 more slices," Emily confirmed. "Lord have mercy," Darnell said, and disappeared. Emily turned to Jackson. He was looking at his coffee mug. "You knew that was going to work," she said. "I didn't know anything," he said. "I just didn't give them anything to push against." "That's the same thing," he considered. "Maybe." "Where did you learn to do that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Took me about 15 years of doing it wrong first." He set the mug down. "When you're younger, you think the point is to be the loudest thing in the room. Takes a while to figure out that the room listens more when you're the quietest." Emily thought about that. She thought about Calvin standing in the hallway, unable to answer a direct question. She thought about Mike sitting down and ordering pie. She thought about Jackson walking in this morning with a toolkit in his saddlebag and crouching on the floor without announcement and fixing the strip and not once raising his voice or making it about anything other than what it actually was. She thought about herself in 6 days of silence, being so afraid of making noise that she had let the noise be made in her body instead. "I've been doing it wrong too," she said quietly. Jackson looked at her. "Not the loud part," she said, "the opposite. I've been so quiet about everything that when something actually needed to be said, I didn't know how to say it anymore. I just kept walking through the problem. Literally." She laughed, brief and dry. "I walked through a broken floor for 8 days because I was afraid of what speaking up would cost me." "And what did being quiet cost you?" he asked. She held up her arm. He nodded. "Once." "Yeah, that's not a new lesson," she admitted. I've known it. I kept thinking the thing I was protecting was more fragile than the thing I was sacrificing. What were you protecting? She thought about it honestly. The version of me that doesn't need things. The one who handles it. The one who everyone can count on because she never asked for anything back. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, people can count on you and you can need things. Those aren't opposites. She opened her mouth and closed it again. You act like asking for help is a character flaw, he said. Like every time you need something, you're handing in some kind of report card that says you failed. He looked at her with the directness he'd always had, the Jackson Carter version of gentleness, which was just honesty delivered without cruelty. You're not failing when you need things. You're just human. Roy Hutchins from his stool, 3 seats down, said amen to that. Jackson glanced at him. Roy raised his coffee cup. 40-year truck driver, he said by way of explanation. I spent 30 of those years not asking for help either. Blew out my back on year 31 and spent 6 months learning what happened when you ran out of road. He took a sip. The lady's right to listen to you. Jackson looked at Roy for a moment with what appeared to be genuine respect. You the regular? Jackson asked. 15 years, Roy said. You ever told her that how long you've been coming in? Roy looked at Emily. Figured she knew. Tell her anyway, Jackson said. Roy set his cup down. He turned to Emily with the slightly awkward delivery of a man who was not built for sentiment, but was going to attempt it. Emily, I have been coming to this diner for 15 years. I have had bad mornings and worse afternoons, and some days where the only thing that went right was the coffee you poured me. I should have said something when I saw you limping. I noticed. I didn't speak up. He paused. I'm sorry for that. Emily felt something in her throat. Roy, she said, I'm not done. He cleared his throat. You are the best waitress I have ever had in 15 years of roadside diners across 7 states. And I don't say that because of the coffee. I say it because every single morning you made a man feel like he was worth the time it took you to remember how he takes his breakfast. That's not a small thing. That's actually a very large thing that you've been doing every day without a word of complaint, and I should have told you a long time ago. The diner was quiet, not the tense quiet of an hour ago, the other kind, the kind that settles after something real has been said, and everyone present knows they've just witnessed something worth witnessing. Patty from across the floor pressed both hands to her face. Darnell leaned out the window. His eyes were suspiciously bright. He pointed at Roy. What he said, everything he said. Then he disappeared again. Emily looked at Roy for a long moment. Thank you, she said. And that was all because there wasn't anything bigger than those 2 words for what he'd just given her. Roy nodded, satisfied, and picked up his newspaper. He was done now. He had said the thing. He could return to being Roy. Jackson watched all of this. He picked up his coffee and took a long sip and didn't say anything, which meant he was saying everything. It was about 40 minutes after that when Rachel came back out of the office with a legal pad in her hand and a look on her face that Emily knew well, the look Rachel got when she'd made a decision and was not interested in debating it. She sat at the counter beside Emily and set the legal pad down. I want you to look at this, she said. Emily looked. It was a list. Handwritten, organized, Rachel's work always had a clarity to it that reflected how her brain moved. At the top, workplace safety protocol revised, and beneath it a sequence of steps. Any reported hazard to be acknowledged within 4 hours. Any hazard rated a tripping or burning risk to be addressed within 24 hours. All reports to be logged with timestamps. A standing weekly safety walkthrough to be completed by management and 1 floor employee on a rotating basis, logged and signed, a direct line to Rachel for any hazard that went unaddressed after 24 hours, bypassing the floor manager entirely if necessary. Emily read it twice. This is, she started, not negotiable, Rachel said. It goes into the employee handbook by end of week. I'm also having someone come Monday to assess the full floor for any other loose fittings or damage. We're going to walk the whole building. Emily looked at the list again. Rachel, she said, this is more than I asked for. You didn't ask for anything, Rachel said, and there was a weight behind that observation that landed quietly. That's been your habit for 6 years. You show up, you work, you don't ask for anything. Which I appreciate truly, but it also meant I didn't know things I should have known. She held Emily's gaze. So this isn't more than you asked for. This is what should have been in place all along, And the fact that it wasn't is on me as much as it's on Calvin. Emily set the paper down. This was the part she had the least practice with. Not the confrontation, not the pain, but this. The part where someone in authority looked at her and said, this happened, and it mattered, and we are going to change because of it. She had braced for so many outcomes this morning. She had braced for dismissal. She had braced for the complicated tug-of-war of people defending their decisions. She had even braced for the possibility that Jackson's arrival would make things worse rather than better, that people would see the leather and the numbers and decide the story was about something other than what it was actually about. She had not fully braced for this. For someone simply saying you were right, we were wrong here, is what changes now. She felt Jackson shift slightly on the stool beside her, not moving toward anything, just present, registering. One more thing, Rachel said. She reached into her apron pocket and produced an envelope. She set it on the counter in front of Emily. This week's pay plus your tips, in cash. Don't argue with me about it. Emily looked at the envelope. Rachel, I said don't argue. I'm not arguing, I'm just... Emily. Emily picked up the envelope. She turned it over in her hands. Something about the weight of it was almost unbearable, not because of what it represented financially, but because of what it meant for someone to look at what she'd been carrying and decide it deserved acknowledgement in every form available to them. Thank you, she said. Again, those two small words doing the work of everything larger. Rachel stood tucked the legal pad under her arm and looked across the counter toward Jackson. Your breakfast is on the house, she said. All four of you. Jackson shook his head. We pay. Rachel looked at him. We pay, he said again. You dead in. Not insisting for performance, just insisting because it was his nature, because Jackson Carter had never in his life accepted something for nothing when he had the means to settle his debts. It was a point of pride that had nothing to do with pride in the ordinary sense and everything to do with how he moved through the world. You ate the food, you paid for the food. Simple. Rachel studied him for a moment. Then she said, split the difference. You pay for yours. Your 3 men eat free. Jackson considered this for exactly 1 second. Deal. Rachel allowed herself a brief near smile, the kind she gave when she'd hit upon an arrangement that worked, and walked toward the back. At the table near the window, Mike, the heavyset man, who had arrived with a chip on his shoulder and was now on a second slice of peach pie, looked up. This is really good pie, he said to nobody in particular. I know, Emily said. He looked at her, at her arm, at the slight way she was still favoring her left leg even on the stool. The belligerence from earlier had gone the way belligerence tends to go when you feed a person and let the room warm up around them. What was left was just a man who'd gotten a bad brief and acted on it and was now sitting with the residue of that. I'm sorry, he said, for walking in here like I did. Emily looked at him for a moment. Were you trying to protect someone? She asked. Not accusatorially, just genuinely. He paused. Calvin's my wife's cousin, he said. I thought he was getting pushed around by outsiders. He made a mistake, Emily said. He's not a bad person. He just ignored something he shouldn't have and then didn't know how to fix it. She paused. People do that. It doesn't always mean what you think it means from the outside. Mike was quiet for a moment. Then, you're being pretty fair about it. I've been that person, Emily said. Not about the floor, but other things. Ignoring something because fixing it felt harder than leaving it alone. She shrugged with one shoulder. Doesn't make it okay, just makes it human. Mike nodded slowly. He looked at Jackson. Your sister's something, he said. Jackson, without looking up from his coffee. I know. Emily looked at her brother's profile. The silver in his hair that hadn't been there 2 years ago, the lines around his eyes that had deepened, the way he held his coffee cup the same way he'd held every cup of coffee she'd ever watched him drink, that same particular grip. Right hand around the ceramic left elbow on whatever surface was available. She had grown up watching those hands. They were the hands that had steadied her bike when she was learning to ride without training wheels. That had handed her a tissue without comment the day their mother's lab results came back. That had changed her oil and fixed her screen door and showed up in an ice storm at midnight on a Wyoming highway. Hands that worked, hands that stayed. She had spent so much of her adult life trying not to need those hands. It occurred to her now, sitting in the morning light of the diner she had worked in for 6 years, that not needing them had not made her stronger. It had just made her lonelier, and the loneliness had been so constant and so familiar that she had stopped registering it as loneliness and started calling it independence. "Jackson," she said. I'm glad Rachel called you." He took a sip of his coffee, set it down. "Me too," he said. "I would have called you eventually." "I know. I would have waited until it was worse." He looked at her. "How much worse does it have to get?" The question sat between them. She thought about her ankle. She thought about the burn on her arm. She thought about 6 days of walking through pain and adjusting her step and loading her body with compensation after compensation until the whole structure was straining under the weight of everything she'd refused to put down. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think I've been waiting my whole adult life for something to be bad enough to justify asking for help. And I think the bar I set for bad enough kept moving." "It does that," Jackson said. "Moves itself further every time you clear it. Because you always clear it. Because you're capable and you're tough and you've got more endurance than anyone I've ever ridden with. And those things are true, and they can also be the exact things that hurt you if you're not careful about how you use them." Emily sat with that. Outside, a truck went north on the highway, its sound rising and falling in that long familiar wave. The mountains absorbed it. The morning kept moving. The diner kept being a diner, coffee and conversation, and the scrape of forks on plates and Darnell muttering something under his breath at the grill, and Patty laughing at something a customer said, and Roy Hutchins turning the page of his newspaper with the slow authority of a man who had been reading the news for 60 years and had decided to keep doing it regardless of whether it ever got any better. Calvin appeared in his doorway to the staff hallway. He looked at Emily. He didn't approach. He just stood there, and the distance between them was exactly the right distance for what needed to happen next. His face had gone through something since the morning, something that wasn't quite transformation, but was in that direction. He looked like a man who had spent 45 minutes in an office looking at a version of himself he hadn't particularly wanted to see. "Emily," he said, I just want to say it again, without Rachel in the room and without anyone else listening. I'm sorry. I dismissed what you reported. I made you feel like your safety wasn't worth the time it took to deal with. And that was wrong. Flatly, straightforwardly wrong, and I'm not going to dress it up." She looked at him. The thing about an apology like that, stripped down, no caveats, no qualifications, but here's the context, was that it had a different weight than the apology he'd given earlier with an audience watching. This one came from the quieter place in a person, the place that had had time to sit with it. "Thank you, Calvin," she said, and she meant it. Not as an absolution, not as a clean slate, but as the receipt of something that had been genuinely offered. He nodded, looked at Jackson briefly, something passing between them in that look that required no translation, and then went back through the hallway door. Jackson watched him go. "He'll be better at it," Jackson said, "not because he's suddenly a different person, because now he's someone who's had to sit with what it costs to ignore people." "You think so?" "I've been the person who had to sit with it," Jackson said. "It changes you if you let it." Emily looked at her brother. She wanted to ask what he meant by that, what thing from his own life he was referencing. There was a whole history between them that existed in the spaces they hadn't filled in for each other, years of parallel lives running in different directions, checking in when they could, bridging the gaps during holidays and emergencies, and the occasional phone call that started with the practical logistics and ended somewhere neither of them had planned on going. She didn't ask. Not yet. They had time. He was here today on a Saturday in February in Cedar Hollow, Montana, and the floor was fixed and the pie was almost gone and the coffee was hot, and that was enough for now. She would ask him later. She was learning to believe in later. Trace finished his second cup and stretched in the booth with the sound of a man who had ridden many miles that morning and was feeling it in his shoulders. Marcus had been on his phone for the past 10 minutes doing something efficient and quiet, which was apparently Marcus's baseline mode. The fourth man she had to ask his name at some point had started talking to Roy Hutchins about truck routes through the Cascades, and Roy had visibly come alive in the way Roy only came alive when someone gave him permission to talk about highways. The diner was full and warm and moving, and Emily Carter, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, was not performing fine. She was just there, present in the room, present in the morning, present in the specific, complicated, beautiful, difficult shape of her own life without the constant low-grade management of how that life appeared to other people. Her arm still hurt. Her ankle still hurt. She would have to deal with Calvin's relationship with Rachel going forward. She would have to figure out how to be in this building now that she'd been visible in it in a new way. She would have to learn slowly and probably imperfectly how to speak up before the thing became a crisis instead of after. None of that was small. But something had moved today that had been locked in place for a very long time. And the fact that she didn't yet know all the ways it would settle didn't frighten her the way it would have frightened her yesterday. Because her brother was on the stool beside her drinking his third coffee without being asked if he wanted it. And Roy was laughing at something the fourth man had said about a mountain pass in Oregon. And Darnell was singing now, quietly to himself, some old R&B song she half recognized. And Patty was refilling water glasses with the efficient grace she brought to everything. And the family of four was putting on their coats, and the dad was leaving a tip that was notably generous. And outside the highway went north and south, and the mountains stood where they'd always stood. And Emily Carter sat in the middle of all of it, not invisible, not performing, just there. The Saturday lunch rush came in at 11:30, the way it always did, fast and loud and hungry, the particular energy of people who had finished their morning errands and decided they deserved something warm for the effort. Farmers off their tractors, families done with church, a few highway travelers who'd timed their stop wrong and hit Cedar Hollow right in the middle of everything instead of before or after. Riverside Grill filled up in 20 minutes. Emily watched it happen from her stool at the counter, and she felt the old reflex rise in her. The pull toward movement, toward action, toward the familiar choreography of tray and table, an order pad that had structured her days for 6 years. Her body wanted to get up. Her body didn't know how to be in a diner without working. Patty caught her eye from across the floor and gave her a firm look that said, "Don't you dare." Emily stayed on her stool. But staying still while the diner moved around her was its own particular kind of discomfort. Different from the ankle and the arm and all of it, the discomfort of a person who has built their entire sense of usefulness around motion, suddenly being asked to sit and simply exist in a space where they usually performed. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She kept reaching for things, her order pad, which wasn't in her apron pocket because her apron was folded on the counter beside her, a tray that wasn't there. Jackson watched her do this for about 4 minutes before he said, without looking up from his coffee, "Stop. I'm not doing anything. You keep reaching for things that aren't there." She put her hands flat on the counter. He nodded. "This is very hard," she told him. "I know. I don't know how to be here without working." "You're working on something," he said, "just not the tables." She considered that. He wasn't wrong, she supposed. She was working on the much harder and less satisfying project of sitting inside her own life without managing it into shape. The tables at least gave you feedback, a cleared plate, a refilled cup, a satisfied customer pushing back from the booth. This thing Jackson was suggesting she work on gave you nothing you could see or measure, and Emily had always been better at the visible kind of work. The door opened again. Linda Marsh came in. Emily felt her posture change before her brain caught up to why. Linda Marsh was 63 years old, had steel gray hair she kept in a practical braid, and had been the head of Cedar Hollow's informal business association for the better part of a decade. She was not technically anyone's boss, but she was the kind of woman whose opinion circulated through a small town with the efficiency of a well-maintained irrigation system, quietly, constantly reaching everything. When Linda Marsh had a view on something, Cedar Hollow tended to develop that view within 48 hours. She scanned the room the second she walked in. Her eyes found Emily, moved to Jackson, moved to the Hells Angels cuts on the men in the corner booth, and then came back to Emily with the particular expression of a woman assembling a picture in real time. She walked to the counter. She sat down 2 seats from Emily, which in counter etiquette was the equivalent of sitting right beside her, close enough for conversation, enough gap to make it a choice. "Emily," she said. "Linda, I heard some things this morning." Linda's voice was not unfriendly. It was the voice of a woman who prided herself on getting accurate information before forming opinions, which made her unusual in any town and especially useful to know. "I wanted to come and see for myself." "What did you hear?" Emily asked. Linda looked at Jackson. "This your brother?" "Jackson," Emily said. "Jackson, this is Linda Marsh. She's been coming in for breakfast every Tuesday since I started here. Jackson turned on his stool. He extended a hand. Linda shook it with the firm efficiency of a woman who had shaken a lot of hands. What did you hear? Emily asked again. Linda looked back at her. Two different stories, actually, which is why I'm here instead of forming an opinion from my kitchen. She set her purse on the counter. First story, a bunch of bikers came in and threatened staff and management. Second story, a waitress who'd been hurt on the job finally had someone show up and insist the situation be addressed. She paused. Judging by the fact that you're sitting calmly at this counter and everyone in this room looks fed and reasonably content, I'm guessing the second story is closer. The second story is the story too, Emily said. Tell me the whole thing. So Emily told her. She told it plainly, without drama, without editorializing the floor strip, the maintenance log, the 8 days, Calvin's response, the morning's near miss. Rachel's call. She told it the way she'd learned to tell things, which was the way her mother had taught her. Just the facts lined up honest and let people decide what they think without you pushing them toward a conclusion. Linda listened without interrupting. When Emily finished, Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Jackson. And you came, she said. She's my sister, Jackson said. Linda studied him. You didn't come to make trouble. I came to see what happened. Then I fixed a floor strip. You fixed it yourself. Had the tools. Linda looked at the man for a long moment with the evaluating gaze of someone recalibrating rapidly. Then she looked at Emily. 8 days, she said. The report sat for 8 days. 8 days, Emily confirmed. Linda's jaw moved slightly. And you kept working through it. I didn't want to be difficult. The words sounded different out loud now than they had inside her head for the past week. They sounded smaller. They sounded like exactly the kind of thing you say when you've decided your own pain is a burden to distribute as sparingly as possible. Linda heard it too. Her expression shifted, something maternal and fierce moving through it simultaneously. Emily, she said, being difficult would have been refusing to work. Reporting a hazard and expecting it to be addressed is just basic. That's just the minimum a workplace owes you. I know that now, Emily said. Did you know it then? A pause. I knew it abstractly, Emily admitted. I just didn't think it applied to me, and I kept thinking it's not that bad. Someone else has it worse. I can handle it. And by the time I understood I needed to stop handling it, it was already bad enough to matter. Linda was quiet for a moment. She reached over and put her hand over Emily's on the counter. It was a brief gesture, practical and warm in the way of a woman who was not given to prolonged physical comfort, but understood when one clear touch said more than words. You've been feeding this town for 6 years, Linda said. The least this town can do is make sure your floor is safe. Emily looked at her. I'm going to talk to some people, Linda said. She released Emily's hand. She picked up the menu, which was a formality. Linda always ordered the same thing. This isn't just about your diner. There are 3 other food service businesses on this strip, and I would lay good money that half of them have maintenance logs that look the same. She looked at Rachel, who had materialized behind the counter, with the quiet alertness of a woman who had been tracking this conversation from a distance. You're ahead of the others now, she told Rachel. Keep it that way. Rachel nodded, already in motion. Linda nodded satisfied and put the menu down. Coffee and the vegetable omelet, please, and a slice of whatever pie is left. Peach, Rachel said. Perfect. And just like that, Linda Marsh was eating breakfast, and the conversation was done. But the thing she'd said was still in the room. This isn't just about your diner. And Emily turned it over in her mind while the lunch rush kept building and Patty kept moving and the noise level of the diner climbed to its familiar Saturday peak. It was Darnell who broke first. Emily heard him before she saw what was happening. Heard the particular sound of something being put down with slightly more force than necessary, and then his voice, which was normally so steady and warm, coming through the pass-through window with a different quality to it. Rachel, I need a minute. Rachel crossed to the window. Emily turned on her stool. Darnell's face in the window was doing something she had never seen it do before in 6 years of working beside him. He was 63 years old. He had worked grills and diners and short-order kitchens since he was 19. He had the particular resilience of someone who had been in the food service industry long enough to have seen everything twice and developed the emotional regulation of a person who could not afford to let a bad morning follow him into the afternoon. But his eyes right now were red. not crying. Darnell was not by nature a man who cried in kitchens, but the pressure behind his eyes was unmistakable, and his brow was set in a way that said he was working hard to keep something contained. "What is it?" Rachel asked. Darnell looked at Emily, then at Jackson, then back at Rachel. "I knew," he said. The diner noise continued around them. Patty was taking an order at table 6. The coffee machine was running. Linda Marsh was cutting into her omelet. But at the counter, everything went very still. "What do you mean?" Rachel said. Her voice was careful. "The floor strip," Darnell said. "I knew it was lifting. I've known for 2 weeks. I tripped on it myself one morning early before anyone was in, and I should have." He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I didn't put it in the log because I figured someone would get to it. And then I watched Emily walk through it every day, and I told myself she knew about it. It was reported someone was handling it." He looked at Emily directly. "I saw you favoring your leg on Wednesday, and I asked if you were okay, and you said you were fine. And I let you say that. I let you say it, and I went back to my grill." The silence at the counter was complete. Emily looked at Darnell. Darnell, who had been cutting pie slices this morning with the enthusiasm of a man at a birthday party, who had hollered from the kitchen every time something good happened, who had been the warmest, most consistently decent presence in this building for the entire 6 years Emily had worked here. She didn't know what to say. "Darnell," she started. "I'm not looking for you to let me off the hook," he said. I needed to say it out loud. Because I've been standing back there for the last 2 hours thinking about how that floor strip has been there for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and I knew, and I didn't say anything, and you got hurt, and I made you pee like that made it better." His voice had gone rough. "It doesn't make it better." Rachel had her hand on the pass-through ledge, and she was quiet in the way she went quiet when she was processing something that required her to think carefully before she responded. She looked at Darnell. She looked at Emily. She looked briefly at Jackson, who was sitting still and quiet beside Emily and had been throughout this the same way he'd been throughout everything today, present without inserting, watching, without judging. "Why didn't you report it 2 weeks ago?" Rachel asked. Not accusatorially, just the question plain. Darnell thought about it. "Because I figured it wasn't my department," he said finally. "Kitchen stuff, that's mine. I report problems in my kitchen. I fix things in my kitchen. The floor out there, that's floor management. That's Calvin's territory. I didn't want to step on anyone's toes." He paused. "That's a stupid reason. I know it's a stupid reason now." "It's not stupid," Emily said. He looked at her. "It's just a thing that happens," she said. "Everyone waits for someone else's department to handle it. Calvin waited because it wasn't urgent enough for his list. You waited because it wasn't your zone. I waited because I didn't want to push. And meanwhile, the floor just kept being broken." Darnell closed his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said. "I mean it from the bottom of my chest." She held his gaze. "I know you do, Darnell." A beat. "I'm not angry at you." "You could be." "I could be," she agreed, "but I'd be spending energy on something that's already done and can't be undone, and I've spent enough of my energy this week on things I can't change." She looked at him steadily. "What I'd rather have is your word that the next time you see something wrong, you say something, regardless of whose zone it is." He nodded. "You have it," he said, "carved in stone." Rachel turned to him. "Same goes for every hazard in this building, kitchen or floor. You see it, you report it, you tell me directly if it doesn't get handled. That's the new rule for everyone. I'm putting it on paper today." Darnell nodded again, and the tightness around his eyes eased a fraction. "Not all the way. You didn't earn that kind of ease back in a single conversation, but enough to let him breathe." He disappeared from the window. 30 seconds later from the kitchen, Emily heard him start humming again, slower this time, quieter, the sound of a man trying to find his footing again on familiar ground. Jackson leaned over to Emily. "He's a good man," he said quietly. "The best," she said. "Good men make mistakes too." "I know." She watched the pass-through window. "The thing about being the person who never asks for help is that everyone around you stops thinking you might need it. They look at you and they see capability, and they assume you've got it handled. And then the whole structure it looks out for itself while you carry whatever's wrong quietly." She paused. "I did that to Darnell as much as he did it to himself. Jackson looked at her sideways. Don't do that. Do what? Take on other people's accountability. She opened her mouth. You telling him you were fine when he asked, Jackson said, that's not the same as you being responsible for what he noticed and didn't report 2 weeks ago. Those are separate things. He held her gaze. You can understand why someone did something without it being your fault they did it. Them being the same thing is not the deal. She stared at him. When did you get wise? She asked. He looked back at his coffee. I've had a long time on the road to think, he said. Not much else to do at 60 miles an hour except pay attention. The lunch rush peaked, and then around 1:30 began to level off the way it always did, not dropping suddenly, but finding its natural plateau, the tables turning over more slowly, the urgency dropping out of the room's energy like air arm out of a tire. Patty started running on fumes, but running competently the way she always did in the back half of a long shift. And Rachel had jumped in to help with refills and boasting in the way she did when the floor was slammed, and she didn't stand on ceremony about the difference between managing and working. Trace came to the counter with the empty pie plates and set them in the bus bin without being asked. Rachel noticed and said nothing, which was her version of appreciation. Marcus had refilled his own coffee twice using the carafe on the counter, compensating each time with a careful look to see if it was allowed, and both times Emily had waved him off with a hand gesture that meant yes, obviously please. The fourth man, she had finally learned his name, was Cole. Had spent a portion of the morning in quiet conversation with 3 different truckers who'd come in for lunch, and Emily had caught enough fragments to understand that the conversations were about routes and road conditions and the particular fraternity of men who covered distance for a living, which turned out to transcend the difference between a semi-truck and a motorcycle in the way that most practical things transcend the categories people build around them. The town was settling into a new shape around what had happened this morning. Emily could feel it, couldn't point to exactly where she felt it, couldn't have named the specific sensation, but it was there. The way the regulars were treating her had shifted by some small but real degree. Roy had stayed longer than usual. Linda had lingered over her coffee. The trucker at table 3, a man named Dale who came through Cedar Hollow every other week and always ordered the patty, Melt had caught her eye on his way out and said, Heard you had a rough week, Em. Glad things are being sorted. He hadn't elaborated. He hadn't needed to. Small towns ran on exactly that kind of economy. The acknowledgement that was its own complete statement. She was being seen. Not because she'd made noise, not because she'd made a scene or forced an issue in a dramatic way, but because something true had come to the surface today, and the people who had been in the room while it happened were carrying it with them now into the rest of their Saturday. She was still sitting with that when Calvin came out of the back hallway for the second time. This time he didn't stop in the doorway. He came all the way to the counter and sat down 2 stools from Emily on the side away from Jackson, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. He ordered a coffee from Rachel with the careful courtesy of a man operating on his best behavior, and then he sat there with the mug in both hands and looked at the counter for a moment before he said, There's something I didn't say earlier that I need to say. Emily turned on her stool to face him. Calvin looked at his coffee. He was not good at this, she could see that clearly. He was not a man built for the stripped-down version of things, for the kind of honesty that didn't have any professional distance built into it. He was a manager. He had learned to speak in the careful language of workplace communication, the kind that preserved relationships and avoided liability and kept everything functional. This kind of talking, just a man at a counter saying what was actually true, was visibly difficult for him. That almost made her like him more. Almost. I want to tell you why I didn't act on the report, he said. She waited. It wasn't because I thought you were lying, he said, and it wasn't because I didn't think the floor needed fixing. I knew it needed fixing. I put it on the list. He paused. I put it on the list, and then 3 other things went on the list above it, and it kept getting pushed. And every day I walked through the kitchen, I thought, yeah, that's on the list, we'll get to it. And I never once stopped to think about what was happening to you in the meantime. He looked up. I stopped thinking about you as a person and started thinking of the floor issue as a task, and tasks you can defer. People you can't. The diner hummed quietly around them. Emily stopped. Started again. That's a more honest answer than I expected. I've had time to sit with it. He held her gaze with the uncomfortable steadiness of someone choosing not to look away from something difficult. I also want you to know that what you said earlier about doing everything right, about reporting it, about not wanting to be difficult, I heard that. I'm going to hear it for a long time. He paused. You followed every protocol exactly as it's supposed to work. The protocol failed you. I failed the protocol. That's the sequence, and I want to be clear about it. Beside Emily, Jackson had gone very still. Not tensely, not warily, but with the attention of someone listening to something that was worth listening to carefully. Emily looked at Calvin for a long moment. What happens now? She asked. Not to me. I know what Rachel's doing. I mean for you. What does this change for you? He seemed surprised by the question. Surprised that she was asking about him, probably surprised that a person he had wronged was asking what they could expect from him going forward, rather than simply demanding consequence. I'm going to slow down, he said, on everything. I've been running this floor like a checklist for 3 years, and I've gotten efficient at the wrong things. He turned the mug in his hands. Efficient at processing tasks, not efficient at paying attention to the people doing the work. A pause. Rachel's putting in the new reporting system. I support it, not just because she told me to, because if something like this had been in place, I would have had it flagged to me differently, and I like to think I would have acted differently. He paused. I like to think. But you're not sure, Emily said. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I'm not sure, and I think sitting with that uncertainty is probably part of what I need to do right now. That was the most honest thing she'd heard anyone say all day. More honest even than the apology itself, because an apology was a statement about the past. Uncertainty about who you were going forward was a statement about the hard ongoing project of becoming someone better, and that project didn't come with guarantees. Okay, Emily said. He looked at her. Okay, she said again. Let's see what you do with it. He nodded, finished his coffee. He looked at Jackson briefly, just a glance brief and direct, and Jackson returned it with the same directness, and something passed between them that Emily didn't try to decode but recognized as the particular communication of two men deciding without words that they were not enemies. Calvin put his mug down and went back to work. Jackson picked up his coffee. You're a fair person, he said to Emily. I'm trying to be. No, you are. That's different from trying. He took a sip. A lot of people in your position would have stayed angry, kept the account open. What would that cost me? He shrugged. Nothing, maybe. Some people run better on anger. I don't, Emily said. It's expensive fuel, takes too much to maintain, and doesn't go far enough. He looked at her. Mom used to say that, she added. He smiled then, really smiled, the full version that she'd seen maybe a dozen times in her life, rare enough to be worth something real enough to change his whole face. Yeah, he said. She did. He set the mug down. She would have liked today. Emily felt the edge of that the way she always felt when their mother entered a conversation, that combination of warmth and ache that never fully resolved into one thing or the other. She breathed through it. She would have had opinions, Emily said. She had opinions about everything. She would have told Rachel her coffee was too strong. Jackson laughed, actually laughed short and real, and the kind of sound that made Trace look up from the booth with an expression of genuine surprise, because apparently Jackson Carter laughing in a diner was not something Trace had extensive experience with. She told every restaurant their coffee was too strong, Jackson said. Because she was right, Emily said. She was right, he agreed. They sat there for a moment with that between them. Their mother, the two of them, the specific shared territory of people who had grown up in the same house and survived the same years, and carried the same ghost in different ways. It was Rachel who interrupted them, appearing from the kitchen hallway with her coat on and her phone in her hand, and she'd clearly made multiple calls in the past hour because she had the expression of a woman who had moved several things forward and was not done. I have someone coming Monday morning to assess the full floor, she told Emily. Professional. They'll do the whole building? She looked at Jackson. And I spoke to Linda Marsh. You called her, Emily asked. She called me, Rachel said. About 10 minutes after she left. She wants to bring 3 other business owners from the Strip for a meeting next week about safety protocols. She's framing it as a general update, but Rachel looked at Emily. She made it clear that your situation was the catalyst. Emily stared. Linda Marsh is using my sprained ankle to update workplace safety protocols for the entire business strip, she said slowly. That's what's happening. Because Linda Marsh. Because Linda Marsh, Rachel confirmed. Trace had been listening from the booth. Who is this woman, he said. Cedar Hollow, Emily said. Simply. Because Linda Marsh was Cedar Hollow in the way that certain people in small towns become the living expression of the place's best instincts. Not perfect, not always right, but relentlessly invested and genuinely driven by the belief that the community was worth maintaining to a standard. Jackson looked thoughtful. The woman who shook my hand like she was closing a deal. That's her, he nodded. Good. Cole appeared from wherever he'd been, seeming to materialize from a conversation with a trucker at Table 4. Jackson, he said, Dale over at Table 4 wants to know if we know a good road south for tomorrow morning. Says the pass-through Bitterroot has ice. Jackson looked at Emily. You know the roads around here? Emily raised an eyebrow. I've driven them in a blizzard carrying pie. Of course you have. He turned to Cole. Tell him Highway 93 south to Missoula, then pick up I-90 west. Better maintained. Cole went back. Dale at Table 4 nodded at the information with the solemn appreciation of a man receiving good intelligence from a trusted source. Emily watched this happen. There was something about it that was almost funny and also entirely not funny. The way the diner had absorbed all of them, the way Cedar Hollow had absorbed all of them, the way a morning that had started with a sprained ankle and a pot of spilled coffee had managed to become this, whatever this was. A full diner with its stories braided together, with her brother recommending highway routes, and Linda Marsh making phone calls, and Darnell humming in the kitchen, and Roy reading his newspaper, and Calvin doing inventory in the back with the deliberate focus of a man trying to be useful as penance. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up from the counter and looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Then she read the message and understood. It said, this is Mike from earlier. I called a few people who came in this morning expecting a problem. Just wanted you to know I told them the real story. Sorry again for the entrance. She stared at the text for a moment. Then she showed it to Jackson. He read it, said nothing for a second. Then how'd he get your number? No idea. Small town, Roy said from 3 stools away without looking up from his newspaper. Emily looked at Roy. Were you listening to that? I'm 71 years old and I've been sitting at this counter for 15 years, Roy said mildly. Of course I was listening. Emily typed back, thank you, Mike. She paused, then added pies here most Saturdays. She put her phone down. Jackson had been watching her. You're something else, he said. It costs nothing to be decent about it, she said. And it costs a lot to be otherwise. He shook his head slightly the way he sometimes did when she said something that was simply true and he had nothing to add to it. It was the head shake of a man who was proud without having a shape for the feeling. The afternoon moved forward. Around 2 o'clock, the diner dropped below half capacity and the lunch energy began to settle into the quieter afternoon mode. A few tables of people lingering over coffee, the sound system audible again. Now that the noise wasn't competing with it, Darnell starting his prep work for the dinner setup. Patty finally sat down for the first time since 9 in the morning and drank a glass of water and looked at Emily with the expression of someone who had run a marathon and wanted everyone to know it without making an announcement. Jackson's phone rang. Enduring. He checked it. Something moved across his face, not alarm, but the particular attentiveness of a man who had responsibilities running in parallel to this one. He looked at Emily. I need to take this, he said. 5 minutes. Go, she said. He stepped away from the counter and toward the quieter back corner phone to his ear. Trace looked up from the booth when Jackson moved, tracked him automatically with the habitual awareness of someone who had spent a long time watching another person's back. Emily sat alone at the counter for the first time in hours. She was aware suddenly of how much less the ankle hurt than it had this morning. She'd been still long enough that the acute edge of it had settled into a dull background. Ache still there, still present, but no longer the thing demanding all her attention. Her forearm had cooled. The redness would probably be a mild burn by tomorrow, nothing serious, nothing permanent. She looked around the diner. This was her place. This was where she had spent 6 years learning who she was under pressure, not in dramatic moments, but in the daily accumulated pressure of showing up, handling things, being reliable. She had learned things about herself in this building that she couldn't have learned anywhere else. She had learned what it felt like to be someone people counted on. She had learned how to hold a section alone when the other server called out. She had learned that she was capable of more than she thought, And also that capability had a cost she'd never learned to account for. She was learning that now, right here, at this counter. Jackson came back. He sat down, put his phone away, looked at her. "I need to head out by 4, he said. She nodded. She'd known it was coming. Jackson didn't stay. He passed through towns, through situations, through the specific emergencies and celebrations of the people he loved, and then he rode on because that was the shape of his life, and he'd made his peace with it. She had made her peace with it too, mostly. 4, she said. "Okay, you're going to be all right," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," she said, "and next time something goes wrong, I'll call," she said, "before it's bad." "Before it's bad," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. "I mean it, Em, not when it's crisis level, when it's still manageable. That's when I want the call." She looked at her hands on the counter. "That's hard for me." "I know it is. I feel like I'm wasting your time when it's not bad enough. Let me decide what wastes my time," he said. "You think calling you when I've got a rough stretch is wasting your time?" She looked up. "You never call me when you've got a rough stretch." He was quiet for a half second. "No," he said, "I don't." "So we're both doing it." Another half second. "Yeah," he said, "we are." He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down. "We're going to have to get better at that." Emily felt something ease in her chest. Not release, it wasn't that clean. Just ease. The slight change in pressure when two people who have been maintaining the same careful distance decide without announcement to close it by an inch or two. Rachel appeared beside them with the coffee carafe and refilled Jackson's mug without comment. She met Emily's eyes briefly, and in that look was everything she hadn't said out loud since this morning. Gratitude and guilt and relief and something that was simply plainly one woman recognizing another woman who had been carrying something too heavy alone for too long. "You working next week?" Rachel asked Emily. "Yes. Tuesday through Saturday. Short shifts through Wednesday. Full shifts Thursday and Saturday when you're ready." She held up a hand before Emily could speak. "Non-negotiable." "You said that already. I'm saying it again because you have the look of someone planning to call me Sunday night and offer to come in Monday." Emily pressed her lips together. "Tuesday," Rachel said firmly. "Tuesday," Emily conceded. Jackson watched this exchange with his coffee mug halfway to his mouth, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to pure contentment she had seen on him in years. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just good to see someone else saying non-negotiable to you besides me." Emily turned back to the counter. Outside, the afternoon had settled into the blue-gray light of a February afternoon in Montana. The sky, that color that wasn't quite overcast and wasn't quite clear, but was particular to this part of the country. In this season, the sky of a place that understood the long game of weather, that knew winter didn't hurry and didn't need to. The mountains were still there, the same as they'd been this morning. The same as they'd been every morning of the 6 years Emily had driven into Cedar Hollow and tied her apron and started moving. She had always found something steadying in that permanence. The mountains didn't care what kind of shift she'd had. They were there regardless. Today, for the first time, she thought that maybe that was the wrong thing to take comfort in. The mountains being permanent didn't mean she had to be immovable. The mountains being indifferent didn't mean the people in the diner had to be. She had spent 6 years taking comfort in the constancy of a place, and 6 years forgetting to take comfort in the people who kept showing up to it. Roy with his newspaper and his 15 years of black coffee, Darnell with his humming and his double thumbs up, and the confession that had cost him something real. Linda Marsh with her firm handshake and her phone calls. Rachel with her legal pad and her non-negotiables, and the look she'd given Emily that said more than speeches. The truck drivers who asked where she was when Patty covered her tables. The family of 4 whose father had left a generous tip. Mike texting an apology from a number she hadn't known. Her brother driving 40 minutes without eating with a toolkit in his saddlebag because someone called. These were the things that had always been here. She had just been too busy watching her step to notice how many of them had been watching out for her. Jackson left at 4:03. Not 4 exactly, he wasn't the kind of man who made a performance out of punctuality. But 3 minutes passed because Darnell had come out of the kitchen specifically to shake his hand, and the handshake had turned into something longer. The kind of exchange between two men who didn't know each other and weren't going to pretend they did but recognized in each other something worth acknowledging. Darnell had said, "You take care of yourself out there on those roads." Jackson had said, "You take care of her in here." And Darnell had nodded with the gravity of a man accepting a commission, which was exactly what it was. Trace had hugged Emily, which surprised her completely. She had not pegged Trace as a hugger, and it was a real hug, the kind with actual force behind it, the kind that said, "I am glad you exist and I mean that." Marcus had shaken her hand with both of his, which was its own kind of warmth. Cole had said, "Best peach pie in Montana easy." And Emily had said, "It's the only peach pie you've had in Montana." And Cole had said, "Doesn't change anything." And she had almost liked him best of all for that. And then Jackson. He stood in front of her at the door, and she stood in front of him, and they were both people who had never been good at goodbyes, not because they didn't feel them, but because they felt them too much and had learned early that compressing the feeling into something practical was the only way to get through it intact. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she said. "I'll call you when I'm back on the floor." "Call me before that." "Jackson, not about the floor. Just call." He held her gaze. "Tell me how the ankle is. Tell me what Rachel says Monday. Tell me whatever's happening." A pause. "I want to know. I'd always want to know. I just don't always make that clear enough." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "I'll call." He nodded. Then he did something he almost never did. He put his hand on the side of her face for just a moment, the way their father used to do, the way you touch someone when words have reached their limit and you need to say the rest with something more direct. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then he dropped his hand, turned, and walked out the door. She watched through the front window as the four of them mounted up. The bike started that sound, that particular layered rumble that she had always associated with Jackson leaving, and Jackson arriving in equal measure, the sound of him in motion, which was his most natural state. They pulled out of the lot and onto the highway and headed south, and she watched until the sound dropped below hearing, and the highway was just the highway again, empty and gray and stretching toward the mountains. She stood at the window for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned around. The diner was in its late afternoon configuration, half the tables empty, the light coming through the windows at the angle that meant the day was tipping toward evening, Patty wiping down the counter with the efficient exhaustion of someone in the final hour of a long shift. Roy Hutchins had finally left around 3 after nearly 8 hours at that counter, which had to be a personal record even for Roy. Darnell was back in the kitchen, audible, but not visible. The sound of prep work, the rhythmic chopping and clanging of a man organizing his space for what came next. Rachel was at the register going through something on the computer with the focused attention she brought to administrative tasks. She looked up when Emily came away from the window. "You okay?" Rachel asked. "Yeah," Emily said. And the thing was, she was. Not in the everything is resolved way, not in the clean slate way, because life didn't actually work like that, and Emily had lived enough of it to know. Her ankle still ached. Her arm would be tender for a few more days. There were still conversations ahead with Calvin, with the building assessor coming Monday, with the shape of her job now that it had changed in ways she couldn't fully map yet. There was still the project of learning to ask for things before the asking became urgent, which was not a project you completed in a day. None of that was done. But the specific thing that had been wrong since Tuesday morning, the thing that was bigger than the ankle and bigger than the floor strip and bigger than any of the individual facts of the week, that thing had shifted. The weight of being unseen in a place she had given herself to completely. That was what had shifted. She was seen now. Not in the way of someone who had made herself visible through drama or demand, but in the better way, the way that came from something true breaking the surface after being submerged too long. The people in this building had seen her today, and what they'd seen had not made them think less of her. It had made them pull closer. That was not the outcome she had spent 6 days dreading. It was the outcome she had never quite let herself believe was possible. She was still sitting with that when the door opened at 4:20 and Linda Marsh came back in. Emily blinked. Linda had been in twice today already, once for breakfast, once to collect the story, and she was not a woman who made unnecessary trips. She came back in with her coat on and her braids still immaculate, and her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who had spent the intervening hours being productive and was here to report on it. She sat at the counter. She looked at Rachel. "I've made 4 calls," she said without preamble. "Tom Henley at the hardware store, Grace Bowen at the pharmacy, Dave Strickland at the auto shop, and Carl Okafor at the feed supply." She set her hands flat on the counter. "I told each of them what happened to here today. Not the gossip version. The factual version: floor hazard, 8-day gap, injured employee, corrective action taken." She looked at Emily. "I also told them who you are and how long you've worked here and what this diner would look like without you." Emily didn't know what to say to that. "Carl Okafor," Rachel said. She was looking at Linda with an expression of someone who had just understood something. "He's on the county business licensing board." "He is," Linda said. "And Tom Henley is vice president of the Chamber of Commerce." "Also correct." Rachel leaned against the counter. "Linda, what exactly are you doing?" Linda looked at her steadily. "I'm making sure that what happened here today doesn't just become a story people tell. I'm making sure it becomes a standard people meet." She paused. "The business trip meeting I mentioned, and I'm framing it as a proactive safety review for all member businesses. Not punitive, not pointed at anyone specifically, but thorough. And the reason it's happening is going to be on record." Emily looked at Linda. "You're using this morning," Emily said slowly, "to change how Cedar Hollow handles workplace safety." "I'm using this morning to start that conversation, yes." Linda met her eyes. "Is that all right with you?" The question surprised her. It surprised her that Linda was asking, rather than simply doing that. She was treating Emily's experience as something that required her consent to be used even for good purposes. "Why are you asking me?" Emily said. "Because it's your story," Linda said simply. "Not mine, not Rachel's, yours. And I am not in the habit of taking people's stories and using them for other purposes without making sure the person whose story it is has a say." Emily sat with that for a long moment. She thought about the past week, about all the ways other people's decisions had been made on her behalf over her head without her input. The maintenance log ignored the repair, deferred Calvin's phone call to Mike, even Rachel's decision to call Jackson, which had been the right call, but still a decision made about Emily by someone else. She had been the subject of so many choices today that had happened around her rather than with her. This was different. Linda was asking. "Yes," Emily said, it's all right with me." Linda nodded, satisfied. "Good." She looked at Rachel. "I'll need a written account of the timeline from you, not for anything legal, just for the meeting, so people understand the sequence." "I can have that to you by Monday," Rachel said. "Sunday would be better." Rachel didn't even blink. "Sunday." Linda stood. She looked at Emily one more time. "You know," she said, "I've been coming to this diner for years. Tuesdays always. And I've watched you work, and I've never once thought about what it cost you to do it as well as you do." She paused. "I'm going to think about that more carefully going forward. Not just here, everywhere." She pulled on her gloves. "We tend to take the most reliable people for granted. It's a failure of imagination, mostly. We assume that because something works, it doesn't need attention." She looked at Emily directly. "You work, but you needed attention. Those things are not contradictions." She walked out. The diner sat quiet for a moment after the door closed. Patty looked at Emily. "I feel like I just witnessed something important, and I'm not entirely sure what it was." "Linda Marsh deciding something," Emily said. "Is that always like that?" "Pretty much," Rachel said, and went back to her computer. The week that followed moved differently than the weeks before it. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movie transformations, where everything rearranges itself into clarity, and the music swells and people's faces change. Real change didn't work like that, and Emily was old enough and practical enough to know better than to expect it. But it moved differently in the small ways, which turned out to be the ways that mattered. Monday morning, the building assessor came. His name was Frank. He was thorough, and he found 3 things besides the kitchen entrance that needed addressing: a loose railing on the back steps, a worn threshold at the service entrance, and a section of subflooring near the coffee station that had started to give and would have become a problem within a few months. He wrote it all up with photographs and a repair timeline and handed it to Rachel in a folder that she opened, read, and placed immediately into the active files rather than the pending pile. Rachel called Emily to tell her about the assessment, not because she was required to, because she thought Emily should know. Emily noticed that. She filed it in the category of things that were different now. Tuesday, Emily came back to work. She drove into Cedar Hollow in the early morning dark, the way she always did, parked in her usual spot, walked to the back entrance with her usual key, but she stopped at the kitchen entrance before she pushed through. She looked at the floor strip. The repair Jackson had made was solid. She could see the clean new screw where the stripped one had been the metal sitting flush and flat against the floor, the way it was supposed to sit. Frank had noted it in his report as a good temporary fix and confirmed that a full professional replacement was on order for Thursday. She looked at the strip for a long moment. Then she walked through and kept walking. Darnell was already in the kitchen. He looked up when she came through, and something in his face eased the particular relief of a man who had spent 3 days not knowing if things were actually okay and was now seeing with his own eyes that they were. "There she is," he said, quietly this time. Not the big announcement version, the private version. "Here I am," she said. "How's the ankle?" "Better. Wrapped it this morning. I'll be careful." He nodded. He turned back to his prep work. Then he said without looking up, "I called Rachel Sunday night about the subflooring near the coffee station. I'd noticed it softening about a month ago, and I didn't say anything because I thought it was in someone else's department." Emily stopped. "I called Sunday night," he said again. She had the assessor added to the list. She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the way a man who had spent 63 years learning to keep his head down in other people's zones had made one phone call on a Sunday night because he'd decided that wasn't who he was going to be anymore. "Thank you, Darnell," she said. "Don't thank me. Should have been routine." He pulled a pan from the rack. "Is routine now?" She tied her apron. She walked onto the floor. Roy Hutchins was at counter seat 3. Of course he was. "Morning, Em," he said. "Morning, Roy." Usual. She poured his coffee without being asked because she had been pouring Roy Hutchins his coffee for 6 years, and she knew exactly when he wanted it, which was immediately in black and in the big mug, not the standard one. She set it in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it and nodded at her with the comfortable gratitude of a man receiving something that has always been done right. "Heard they found more things wrong with the building," he said. 3 things, she said, all getting fixed. "All getting fixed." He nodded. He opened his newspaper. "Good," he said. She took 2 more orders, started her section, found the rhythm she'd been finding for 6 years, and slipped into it the way you slip into a river current, not fighting it, not performing it, just moving with the thing that already knew where it was going. Her ankle ached at the edges. She noticed it without letting it run her. She moved a little more carefully at the coffee station, mindful of the soft spot in the subfloor that was already marked with a small cone Frank had left as a placeholder until the repair crew came. She noticed the cone and felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. Then she identified it: relief. Not because the problem was solved yet, it wasn't not fully, but because the problem was visible. It had a cone on it. It was on a list with a timeline attached. Nobody was walking past it, pretending it wasn't there, and nobody was being asked to compensate for it quietly in their body while the building got around to dealing with it. Visible problems could be fixed. It was the invisible ones that hurt you. Calvin came in at 9. He did his walkthrough the way he always did, but slower. Emily watched him without making it obvious. She was good at watching things without making it obvious, had been good at that since she was a child. He stopped at the kitchen entrance. He crouched down and looked at the floor strip with his own eyes. He stood and made a note on his clipboard. He moved to the back steps and checked the railing. The repair crew was coming Thursday, but he checked it anyway. The way you check something when you understand for the first time that checking is the job, not just the paperwork. He passed Emily's section on his way back to the office. He stopped. "How's the ankle?" he asked. "Getting there," she said. "Full range of motion." "Mostly the wrap helps." He nodded. He looked like he had more to say. He looked like he was deciding whether to say it or whether saying it would be one thing too many in a week that had already required a lot of him. "I put a standing reminder in my phone," he said finally, "weekly, to review the maintenance log and confirm everything reported in the previous 7 days has been addressed or escalated." He paused. "Rachel doesn't know I did that. I didn't do it because she told me to. He stopped, started again. "I needed a system that didn't rely on my judgment about what was urgent, because apparently my judgment about urgency needed calibration." Emily looked at him. This was the man who had told her to watch her step 8 days ago. This was also the man standing in front of her, now telling her about a calendar reminder he'd set on his own initiative for no audience, for no credit. People were more complicated than their worst moments. She had known that her whole life. It was just easier to remember on the days when you weren't the one who'd been hurt by the worst moment in question. That's a good system, she said. I think so. He met her eyes briefly. I'm glad you're back. She nodded. Me too. He moved on. She went back to her tables. The week kept moving. Wednesday, Linda Marsh's business trip meeting happened, not the one she'd planned for the following week, but an emergency precursor she'd pulled together in 2 days because Linda Marsh had decided that urgency was warranted, and Cider Hollow's business community should be informed of that. Emily heard about it from Rachel, who had attended, who reported that Tom Henley from the hardware store had admitted his back stockroom had a broken step he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. And Grace Bowen from the pharmacy had come forward with a lighting issue in her storage area that had already caused one near miss, and Dave Strickland from the auto shop had produced a maintenance log that hadn't been opened since the previous fall. None of it was malice. All of it was drift, the slow drift of busy people managing busy operations who had gradually stopped treating small hazards as urgent because small hazards that hadn't hurt anyone yet didn't feel like emergencies until they did. Linda had given the meeting a name. She called it the Cedar Hollow Workplace Safety Compact. It was not a legal document. It was not binding in any court. It was just a list of commitments to log, to check, to act, to not let the inconvenience of repair outweigh the cost of injury that 8 business owners signed in a room above the post office on a Wednesday evening. Rachel texted Emily a photo of the signed document. Emily sat on her couch with her ankle elevated and her phone in her hand and looked at the photo for a long time. Her ankle, her maintenance log, her 8 days of silence. They had become this. She called Jackson. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he wasn't writing. He had a rule about the phone and writing that he'd held since she was a teenager and had never broken. He said, not surprised. They had talked twice already since Saturday, which was more than they'd talked in the previous 2 months, and both times had started with the ankle update and ended somewhere further in the way conversations tended to go when people stopped rationing their availability to each other. I need to tell you something, she said. She told him about the meeting, about Linda Marsh, about the compact, about the 8 businesses and the broken step and the lighting issue and the maintenance log that hadn't been opened since fall. Jackson was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for another moment. Then he said, you know what you did? What did I do? You made it safe for other people to admit the same thing was happening to them. He paused. You didn't mean to. You were just trying to get your floor fixed. But that's what happened. You were honest about being hurt in a place you'd given everything to, and it turned out other people were sitting on the same thing in their own buildings and waiting for someone to go first. Emily sat with that. I didn't go first on purpose, she said. Most people don't, he said. That's what makes it matter more. She looked at the photo on her phone. 8 signatures. 8 people who had decided because of a Tuesday that had become a Saturday, that had become a Monday, that had become a Wednesday, to do something small and real about the spaces where the people who work for them moved every day. Trace called you, by the way, Jackson said. He said to tell you the peach pie has been mentioned 3 more times since Saturday. He has a theory that your pie is why the conversation went the way it went and should be credited accordingly. Emily laughed. Tell Trace that's not how causation works. I told him. He said he stands by it. She shook her head. Jackson, she said, yeah. What you said on Saturday about backup versus saving. She paused. I've been thinking about it all week. And I think I've been misidentifying backup as saving for most of my adult life, treating any form of help as proof that I'd failed at something instead of just as something people do for each other. She looked at the photo again. I think that cost me a lot. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. Me too, probably. You too. I'm not better at it than you, he said. I just do it differently. I ride. I put distance between myself and things I don't know how to ask for. I show up when someone calls, but I don't do the calling. A pause. We learned it from the same place, same house, same years, different ways of carrying it. She had never heard him say that. In 42 years of being Jackson Carter, he had never said anything quite that directly about the shape of what they'd both absorbed growing up. He was doing the thing, she was doing the same project, the same Tuesday to Wednesday, of becoming a person who let things be visible. We're going to have to practice, she said. Probably for a long time, he said. Okay, he said. Thursday, the repair crew came. They replaced the kitchen floor strip completely, the whole section, not just the screw, because Rachel had decided that a proper fix meant a proper fix, and not a series of patches applied over the same failing structure. They fixed the back step railing. They reinforced the coffee station's subfloor. They left at 2 in the afternoon, and the building was for the first time in longer than anyone could pin down exactly fully sound. Rachel walked the floor after they left. She walked slowly, thoroughly, pressing her foot at intervals and testing her weight on things. She was doing the thing that should have been happening regularly and hadn't been, and she was doing it now with the particular attention of a woman who had learned what inattention cost and was not interested in the lesson repeating itself. Emily watched her from the counter. Rachel got to the kitchen entrance. She stood on the new floor strip. She pressed down with her full weight. She looked at Emily. Good, she said. Good, Emily agreed. Friday was when the shift happened and that Emily hadn't been expecting. She was running her tables at the peak of the morning rush, not quite full speed, still mindful of the ankle, finding the balance between her natural pace and the pace the ankle could sustain when the door opened and a woman came in that Emily had never seen before. Mid-30s, dark hair, dressed for an office, but carrying the particular tiredness of someone who'd been somewhere difficult before 9 in the morning. She sat at the counter. Emily came over. Coffee. Please, the woman said. Black. Emily poured it. The woman wrapped her hands around the mug. Are you Emily Carter? The woman asked. Emily paused. I am, she said. The woman nodded. My name is Karen Solis. I work at the county labor office in Billings. She met Emily's eyes. Linda Marsh called us on Wednesday. She described what happened here last Saturday and the week before it. She wanted to know if what happened, the reported hazard, the gap in action, the injury that resulted, if that constituted a recordable incident under state workplace safety regulations. Emily set down the coffee carafe. Does it? She said. It does, Karen said. And the reason I'm here in person instead of sending a form letter is because Linda was very specific about wanting someone to come and speak with you directly, not just process it administratively. She paused. You're not in any trouble, neither is Riverside Grill. They have already taken corrective action that exceeds what's typically required. But you have rights in this situation that nobody told you about, and I want to make sure you know what they are. Emily stood very still. Nobody had told her she had rights, not because they were hiding it from her, because she had never asked and nobody had thought to say, because in the space between reported and ignored and hurt, the mechanisms that existed to protect workers had simply not been activated, and they hadn't been activated because Emily hadn't known to activate them, and nobody around her had known either. Tell me, Emily said. Karen spent 40 minutes at that counter. She drank 2 cups of coffee and ate a piece of toast that Emily brought without being asked, and she explained carefully, clearly, without condescension, the workers' rights that applied to Emily's situation. The right to a safe workplace, the right to report a hazard without retaliation, the right to documentation of any injury that resulted from an unremedied reported hazard, the right to have that documentation inform any future medical treatment, the right to know that the record existed. She left Emily with a folder, not thick, not intimidating, just several pages of clear language and a card with Karen's direct number. You don't have to do anything with this, Karen said, but you should have it. Emily looked at the folder. Why did Linda call you? She asked. Karen considered. She said she wanted to make sure the people who handled what happened to you were accountable to something bigger than their own goodwill. She paused. Her words were goodwill fixes 1 floor. Standards fix the next 100. Emily looked at the folder in her hands. Goodwill fixes 1 floor. Standards fix the next 100. She thought about Linda at the counter Saturday morning, saying this isn't just about your diner. She thought about the meeting above the post office. She thought about 8 signatures on a piece of paper that had no legal weight and total moral weight, which was sometimes the more durable kind. She thought about Karen Solis driving from Billings because Linda Marsh had made a phone call. She thought about Rachel's revised policy already printed and posted in the break room. She thought about Darnell's Sunday night call. She thought about Calvin's phone reminder set without audience or instruction. She thought about Roy staying at that counter for 8 hours on a Saturday because he needed to see it through. She thought about Jackson crouching on the kitchen floor with a screw kit from his saddlebag fixing a thing that should have been fixed before she ever had to ask. She was one person. She had been hurt in one specific way, on one specific floor, in one specific building, in one small town in Montana. She had not set out to change anything. She had set out to get through her shift. She had tried for 8 days to be small enough that her pain wouldn't inconvenience anyone, and it had rippled anyway. Not because that she was remarkable, because she was real, and what had happened to her was real, and when real things become visible to the right people, they have a way of moving outward in directions nobody planned. She put the folder in her locker. She went back to her tables. She poured coffee and took orders and delivered plates and remembered who took what and smiled at the people who were regulars and introduced herself to the people who weren't the way she had done every day for 6 years. She moved through the room with the knowledge of her space, the confidence of someone who understood exactly where the tables were and how the floor moved and what each hour of the day sounded like and felt like from the inside. She moved through the room like someone who belonged in it, not because someone had given her permission, because she had always belonged in it. She had just spent too long apologizing for the space she took up. Saturday morning came, exactly 1 week from the Saturday that had changed everything. Emily arrived before sunrise, tied her apron, walked through the kitchen entrance on the new floor strip that sat flat and flush and solid under her feet. Started the coffee, checked the prep list, said good morning to Darnell, who said it back and pointed at her apron and said, "You look like yourself." She didn't know exactly what he meant by that. She thought she understood it anyway. Roy came in at 7:02, counter seat 3, big mug, black coffee, newspaper. "Morning, Em," he said. "Morning, Roy." She poured his coffee. He looked at her for a moment over the rim of his mug as she was turning back to the counter. He had the expression he sometimes had on mornings when he was going to say something that cost him slightly more than his usual conversational output. "I told my daughter about last Saturday," he said, "and she's a nurse, works long shifts, never complains, does the same thing you do." Emily stopped. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her what I watched happen," he said, "and I told her what I said to you." He paused. "She called me back 2 hours later and told me she'd reported something to her supervisor that she'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. A patient handling protocol that had hurt her back twice, and she hadn't said anything because she didn't want to be the person who made things harder." Emily held the coffee carafe and looked at Roy Hutchins sitting on a stool with his newspaper in his big mug and his 71 years of being someone who had watched things and not always spoken up, and was clearly doing the accounting on that now. "Is she okay?" Emily asked. "She's fine. Protocol's being reviewed." He looked at his coffee. "She said she needed to hear that someone else had gone through it before she felt like she was allowed to say something." He picked up the mug. "Seems like a thing people need. Permission to take up space." Emily was quiet for a moment. "We shouldn't need it," she said. "No," Roy agreed. "But we do, for a while, until we don't." She looked at him. "Did she say who she needed to hear it from?" Emily asked. Roy set his cup down. "She said she needed to hear it from someone who looked like they had it together but admitted they didn't. Because people who look like they have it together are the last ones she expected to be going through the same thing." He met Emily's eyes. "She said it mattered that it was you." Emily looked out the front windows at the highway, gray and quiet in the early light. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She checked it. Jackson. A text. "Just how's the floor?" She typed back solid, "How's the road?" His answer came in 30 seconds, same. Then a second later, "Call me tonight." She smiled. She put her phone away. The diner was filling up, the Saturday rhythm beginning its slow build toward the morning rush. The truckers first, then the farmers, then the families, then the travelers. The ordinary machinery of a community feeding itself at the start of a weekend, the same as it had been every Saturday of the 6 years she'd worked here, and every Saturday before that, and every Saturday that was coming. She moved through her tables. She poured coffee and took orders and asked how people's weeks had been. She covered for Patty when Patty got weeded on table 7, and Patty covered for her when she needed to take a minute to wrap her ankle tighter because the rush was picking up and she needed the support. They moved around each other the way they always had, the fluent choreography of two people who had worked the same floor long enough to anticipate each other without discussion. Around 9:30, there was a lull. Emily stood at the counter and breathed. The diner hummed around her. Darnell's music from the kitchen. The coffee machine running its cycle. The particular chatter of Saturday morning in a place where people knew each other and knew the waitress and knew that the coffee was always right and the pie was always worth ordering and the floor was finally properly solidly fixed. Rachel appeared beside her. She stood there for a moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of communication. Linda called this morning, she said finally. Emily looked at her. The county is going to use the Cedar Hollow Compact as a model for a broader voluntary workplace safety initiative across rural businesses in the state. They want to present it at the next regional small business conference. Rachel paused. Linda is going to present it. She asked if you would be willing to be mentioned by name. Emily was quiet for a moment. What would it mean, she asked. It would mean your story is part of the official record of why this matters, Rachel said. Mo as a victim story, as this is what happens when someone speaks up and people listen story. She paused. It would mean people in other towns, other diners, other restaurants and shops and offices would hear your name attached to the idea that workers deserve safe floors and their reports deserve action. Emily looked at the kitchen entrance, at the new floor strip, at the place where everything had started and in another way had ended. She thought about the version of herself who had walked through that entrance 8 days ago and then again and again, adjusting and compensating and carrying it quietly, believing that the way to survive a place you loved was to make yourself small enough that it didn't cost anyone anything to keep you in it. She thought about what that version of herself had cost. She thought about Roy's daughter, 3 weeks of silence suddenly broken. She thought about 8 signatures above a post office. She thought about Karen Solis driving from Billings. She thought about Darnell on a Sunday night picking up the phone. She thought about Jackson riding 40 minutes without breakfast, crouching on a floor saying, "You don't need me to fix your life. You only need someone to remind you that your voice matters." "Yes," she said, "they can use my name." Rachel nodded. She didn't make it a moment. She didn't make it more than it was, which was Emily Carter saying yes to the continuation of something that had already started, yes to being visible, yes to her own story being worth telling. Rachel just nodded and moved back toward the register, and that was exactly right, because that was exactly what you did when someone made a decision that was theirs to make. You acknowledged it and got out of the way. Emily turned back to her tables. She had a full section, a wrapped ankle, a coffee carafe, and 6 years of knowing exactly how this floor moved under her feet. She went to work. Later, much later, after the lunch rush and the cleanup and the end-of-shift paperwork and the parking lot emptying and the highway going quiet the way it did in the late afternoon of a February Saturday in Cedar Hollow, Montana, Emily Carter sat in the last booth by the back window, the one they used for breaks, and drank a cup of coffee that was too strong and didn't bother correcting it. She sat in the quiet that was left after everything else had moved through. She had spent 6 years in this building learning to be invisible in the best possible way, to serve without demanding recognition to work, without needing applause to show up so reliably that her reliability became part of the architecture of the place. Unnoticed the way load-bearing walls are unnoticed until they're gone. She had been proud of that. She had built her sense of self on it. She had confused the dignity of quiet work with the requirement to keep everything quiet, including the things that were wrong, including the cost, including herself. She understood now that those were not the same thing. You could do your work with dignity and still ask for a safe floor. You could be reliable and still be permitted to be hurt when reliability wasn't returned. You could be the person everyone counted on and still occasionally let someone count on you differently. Let someone say, "I'm coming," without you having to earn the right to that, by first proving your situation was catastrophic enough to justify it. You could be capable and still be human. Those had always been the same thing. She just hadn't let herself believe it until a Saturday morning when a pot of coffee went sideways and a boss made a phone call and a brother drove 40 minutes with tools in his saddlebag and a whole town turned out to be paying closer attention than she'd thought. She finished her coffee. She set the mug down. She untied her apron, folded it, and set it on the table, the same apron with her name in green thread that Rachel had given her last Christmas, the same apron with the faded pocket and the ketchup stain that wouldn't wash out. Emily, just her name. Enough. She picked up her keys and her coat. She nodded at Darnell through the kitchen window. He pointed at her and then at the door in the universal gesture of, "Go home, rest, you did good today." She pushed through the back entrance and into the cold February air and walked to her truck. She drove south through Cedar Hollow, past the hardware store, and the pharmacy and the auto shop, and the feed supply, past the buildings where 8 signatures lived in a folder above a post office, past the quiet streets of a town that was slowly and imperfectly, and in the way of all real things, trying to be a little more careful about the people inside it. She drove home. The mountains stood on every side of her, white and enormous and old, the same as they had always been. She used to look at them and feel small. Tonight she looked at them and felt something else, not large exactly, not the grand opposite of small, but present, real, taking up the space she actually occupied in the world, no more and no less, without apology and without performance. Her phone would ring tonight, Jackson calling the way he'd said he would. She would answer. She would tell him about Roy's daughter and Karen Solis and Linda's call and the state initiative. And yes, she'd said, use my name. He would be quiet for a moment, and then he would say something that didn't need to be elaborate to be true. She already knew what it would feel like. It would feel like being heard. Not because she'd finally said the right thing in the right way with the right words, but because she had stopped making herself small enough to disappear, and the people who had always been watching turned out to have been waiting all along for her to take up the space she had always deserved. That was the floor that had needed fixing most, and she had fixed it herself.